Hello there and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets comfortable and science is allowed to slow down a little. This time we're settling in with a question that tends to arrive quietly, often sometime after dinner, sometimes in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, and occasionally with the confidence of an uninvited expert. Why is it that, even when you've eaten enough, even when you know perfectly well you're not in any real danger of fading away from lack of calories, a part of you can still begin asking rather firmly for something sweet? It is a familiar sort of asking, isn't it? Not always loud, not always dramatic. Sometimes it is only a suggestion. A biscuit would be nice. A square of chocolate would hardly count. Perhaps just one spoonful of ice cream to round things off in a civilized manner. And before long, the brain can begin speaking as though this is not merely a preference, but a matter requiring immediate consideration. It is one of the small comedies of being human that a species capable of building telescopes, sequencing genomes, and arguing online about coffee grinders can still be thoroughly distracted by the thought of a glazed donut. There is something almost flattering in the way sugar presents itself, as though it has chosen you personally for a very important appointment. Before we get into any of that, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, or this morning, or perhaps in that odd little stretch of the day when time feels uncertain and the kitchen somehow becomes much more persuasive. And while you're there, you might ask yourself a simple question. What sweet thing tends to call your name most reliably? Chocolate? Pastries? Cereals that claim to be wholesome while tasting suspiciously like dessert? Perhaps fruit, which wears the respectable clothes of nature while still arriving with quite a lot of sugar tucked inside. It is always interesting how personal these cravings can feel. One person dreams of cake, another wants gummy sweets, someone else says they do not even have a sweet tooth, right up until a stressful Tuesday evening places a tray of cookies nearby and reveals a rather different truth. If you find this soothing or useful, or simply a pleasant way to unwind while your mind settles, I'd be very grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this calm little corner of science reach other people who might also enjoy a slower way of learning. And now let's ease into the question properly, because the answer is not that you are weak, broken, lacking discipline, or mysteriously possessed by the spirit of a Victorian confectioner. The answer is more interesting than that, and far more forgiving. Your appetite for sugar is not a random flaw in an otherwise sensible species. It is the result of biology doing exactly what biology tends to do, which is to solve one problem and accidentally create three more once supermarkets, vending machines, office birthdays, food delivery apps, and family-sized packets of biscuits enter the picture. One of the first things worth saying is that wanting sugar is not the same thing as being hungry in the old-fashioned sense. Those two states overlap, certainly, but they are not identical twins. Real physiological hunger is the body asking for fuel. It comes with its own signs, a hollow feeling, a drop in energy, that broad sense that eating almost anything would be acceptable. A sugar craving is often more specific, more selective, and frankly, a bit more theatrical. You may reject the idea of eggs, bread, rice, soup, or yesterday's leftovers with total confidence, then suddenly find yourself deeply committed to the concept of chocolate-covered something. That tells us immediately that more than raw energy need is involved. Somewhere inside the brain, circuits concerned with memory, reward, expectation, stress, and habit are joining the conversation. This is where things begin to get properly biological. Sweetness is not just a flavour humans happen to enjoy by cultural accident. It is one of the oldest useful signals in the food world. Sweet taste often points toward carbohydrates, and carbohydrates can be turned into glucose, and glucose is a fuel your cells are very happy to receive. Your brain, in particular, is an expensive organ. It is not large compared with the rest of the body, but it is greedy. It burns through energy at a remarkable rate for something that mostly sits in darkness, inventing worries and remembering embarrassing comments from 2014. From an evolutionary point of view, a built-in attraction to sweetness was not foolish at all. It was practical. If a plant offered safe, energy-rich food, an animal that noticed and preferred that sweetness had a decent advantage. The trouble, as with so many human arrangements, is that the system was designed under conditions very different from the ones we now inhabit. For most of human history, intense sweetness was not lounging around every street corner in colourful packaging. It was comparatively rare. You might find it in ripe fruit, honey if you were bold or lucky enough to deal with bees, and a handful of seasonal or regional foods. A sweet taste once suggested opportunity. It said, "Here is energy, and it is available now." Your ancestors did not need a lecture on moderation every time they found a beehive. Nature had already handled moderation by making sugar hard to find, awkward to collect, or seasonal enough that you could not casually wander into the kitchen in February and locate a cinnamon bun the size of a decorative pillow. Modern life has changed that arrangement in a way your nervous system has not entirely caught up with. The ancient machinery is still there, still attentive to sweetness, still ready to learn from it, but the environment has become absurdly generous. You're no longer a forager scanning for scarce calories in a landscape of uncertainty. You're more likely a modern human standing in a brightly lit shop where sweetness has been engineered, refined, stacked, advertised, delivered, frozen, poured, whipped, baked, and positioned at eye level. Your brain arrives with the instincts of an animal that evolved to treat sugar as valuable, and the world responds by offering 14 kinds of caramel before you have even reached the till. Under those circumstances, continuing to want sugar is not particularly mysterious. In some ways, it would be stranger if you didn't. Still, that explanation alone is not enough, because it does not quite capture the intensity of the experience. Plenty of things are useful and appealing without producing that repetitive little nudge in the mind. Nobody usually stares into the middle distance and whispers, "I would simply do anything for a nice bowl of lentils." So something more is happening. Sweet taste does not just deliver energy, it also recruits the brain's learning and reward systems. When sugar arrives, the brain pays attention. It notes the event. It files away the circumstances. It asks whether this should happen again. And because sweet foods often come with a quick and noticeable change in pleasure, alertness, comfort, or emotional relief, the answer is frequently yes. This is the point where many people start talking about dopamine, usually in a tone suggesting that dopamine is a sort of chemical villain in a dark cloak pulling levers behind the curtain. It is more accurate and kinder to the molecule to say that dopamine is involved in noticing, motivating, and learning from rewards. It helps mark certain experiences as important and worth repeating. If a food is pleasurable, especially if it is reliably pleasurable, the brain becomes better at recognizing the cues that predict it. That might be the sight of a wrapper, the smell of something baking, the end of a meal, the time of day, the sofa, the television, the drive home from work, or the emotional atmosphere of a difficult afternoon. Over time, the wanting can begin before the eating. In fact, it often does. The cue shows up and the brain gets ahead of itself. You may have noticed this in your own life. Perhaps you're not particularly interested in sweets during a busy morning, but around 9 o'clock in the evening a very specific appetite appears. Or maybe you are perfectly able to walk past a bakery most days, but after poor sleep, an argument, a deadline, or an especially dull meeting, the same pastries begin to look like deeply reasonable companions. That shift matters. It tells us sugar cravings are not merely about sugar itself. They are about context. The body and brain are always making calculations, many of them outside awareness, and those calculations change depending on stress, fatigue, blood sugar, habit, expectation, and even simple exposure. The more often a sweet food is paired with comfort or relief, the more efficiently the brain learns the association. And there's another small trick in all this. Sugar does not need to be extraordinary to be effective. It simply needs to be reliable. A person does not usually build a craving because of one astonishing dessert consumed once on holiday under a dramatic sunset. More often, cravings grow from repetition. The little sweet thing after lunch, the treat during the mid-afternoon slump, the snack that smooths the drive home, the dessert that marks the end of the day. These patterns sound innocent because individually they often are, but the brain is a superb accountant of repeated experience. It notices what tends to happen, what tends to help, what tends to produce pleasure, and it starts nudging behaviour in that direction with impressive persistence. A habit does not have to be grand to become deeply rooted. It only has to be repeated until it starts feeling like part of the furniture. What makes this especially confusing is that the wanting and the liking do not always stay neatly matched. Sometimes you strongly want a sugary food, and then, once you have it, the experience is pleasant but not nearly as life-changing as the craving promised. That mismatch is one reason people can feel baffled by their own behaviour. Why did I want that so much? Because the brain's motivational systems are not a simple democracy. Anticipation can become louder than satisfaction. The chase can begin speaking more confidently than the meal itself. A cue can trigger wanting even when the actual reward has become routine. This is not madness. It is a feature of how learning works. The brain is trying to steer you toward what has paid off before, not necessarily what will make philosophical sense 5 minutes from now. Then there is the matter of speed. Sugary foods, especially the highly processed kind, are often easy to eat, easy to digest, and quick to influence both blood glucose and mood. They do not ask much of you. No chopping, no soaking, no waiting, no chewing with the dedication required by a sensible cabbage. They arrive ready to be eaten and often disappear in the sort of time it takes to pretend you're only having one. That convenience changes behaviour. Human beings are powerfully shaped by friction. When something pleasurable is close at hand and easy to consume, it happens more often. When it is far away, wrapped in effort, and dependent on peeling, chopping, cooking, cooling, or the use of a pan you do not wish to wash, motivation begins to negotiate. All of this starts to explain why sugar can occupy such a strange place in daily life. It is ordinary enough to seem harmless, powerful enough to be memorable, and common enough to become woven into routine. It can be celebration and consolation, reward and boredom remedy, childhood nostalgia and adult coping strategy. It can appear at weddings, funerals, meetings, holidays, break rooms, petrol stations, cinemas, airports, breakfast tables, and midnight kitchens. Few foods have managed such range. Sugar is not just a nutrient category or a taste sensation. In modern life, it often becomes a social signal and an emotional shorthand. That gives it more ways to stay relevant in the brain. And because it is so familiar, people often blame themselves rather than the design of the system around them. They say, I just have no willpower. I just need to be stricter. I just need to stop wanting it. But that last one is especially revealing because it assumes wanting is a simple moral decision. Most of the time it isn't. You can influence it, certainly. You can work with habits, sleep, food structure, stress, and environment. You can reduce the volume of the cravings over time, but wanting itself is a biological event. It rises from systems built to keep you alive, guided by learning processes that care much more about repetition and reward than about the latest promise you made to yourself on a Sunday evening. That is why harshness rarely works for long. The brain does not respond beautifully to being shamed for following patterns it has been trained into. It tends to respond better to understanding, consistency, and a more strategic kind of care. If you are chronically tired, highly stressed, underfed earlier in the day, surrounded by easy, sweet options, and accustomed to using sugar as a brief emotional landing pad, then experiencing cravings is not evidence of personal collapse. It is evidence that several biological and behavioural systems are converging right on schedule. Change the conditions and the wanting often changes too, though not always instantly and not always in a perfectly tidy line. For now, though, the most useful place to begin is with a gentler question than why am I doing this to myself? A better question is what is my brain trying to achieve here? Fast energy, predictable comfort, a break in tension, a learned reward at the end of effort. Once you begin looking at cravings that way, they stop seeming like random sabotage and start looking more like messages from a nervous system using the tools it knows. Sometimes those tools are out of date. Sometimes they are too eager. Sometimes they have been encouraged by a food environment that behaves like a magician who never stops pulling sweets from a hat. But even then, there is logic underneath the noise. So when the thought of sugar appears, whether as a whisper or a very persuasive campaign, what you are feeling is not just taste in the narrow sense. You are feeling biology meeting memory, ancient preference meeting modern abundance, reward learning meeting convenience, and a brain that still carries old instructions into a world those instructions were never designed to handle. That is the real beginning of the story, and once you see that, the craving becomes less mysterious. Not simple, perhaps, not harmless in every form, but less mysterious. Because to understand why sweetness can feel so compelling now, we need to look more closely at the piece of you that first learned to value it so highly in the first place. The brain that never really asked to outgrow its sweet tooth and, in truth, had very little reason to. That point matters more than it first appears, because the brain's preference for sweetness is not some late bad habit added on top of an otherwise neutral system. It is older than your resolutions, older than your diet plans, older than the neat modern idea that food should be judged primarily by labels, macros, and self-control. In a very real sense, the human nervous system arrived already prepared to treat sweetness as good news. Not morally good, of course, but biologically useful, safe, valuable, worth approaching again. You can see this early in life, long before anyone has had time to develop complicated opinions about dessert. Human infants tend to show a clear preference for sweet tastes. That is not because they have already become connoisseurs of pastry. It is because the system comes wired with broad priorities. Sweetness usually signals energy, and energy is expensive business when you're trying to grow an entire body from scratch. A developing brain, a growing skeleton, muscles, organs, all of it needs fuel. Natural selection did not have much incentive to produce babies who looked at calorie-rich foods with cool indifference and a refined interest in steamed greens. It favoured organisms that were drawn toward what could support survival and development. There is also a practical side to this. Across much of nature, sweetness is a fairly useful signal. Bitter tastes, by contrast, often appear in substances that can be toxic or irritating. The categories are not perfect, and biology never deals in perfect categories, but they are good enough to shape tendencies. Sweet often means carbohydrate, ripeness, digestibility, reward. Bitter often means caution. Sour may mean spoilage or fermentation, though sometimes also useful acidity. Salty helps identify mineral content. The tongue is not just collecting pleasant sensations for entertainment. It is acting as part of an ancient detection system, one that helps the body sort what is worth swallowing from what is better ejected. In humans, that sweet signal is detected by taste receptors specialized to respond to sugars and some other sweet compounds. Once activated, those receptors send messages through cranial nerves into the brainstem and onward, into networks that process taste, pleasure, memory, expectation, and motivation. By the time you consciously register that something tastes sweet, quite a bit of biology has already taken notice. The experience is not confined to the tongue. Taste is the beginning of a conversation that recruits the whole body. Hormones get involved. The digestive system begins preparing for what is incoming. The brain starts comparing what is happening now with what has happened before. It asks, do we know this? Did this help last time? Should we remember where to find it again? That last question turns out to be very important. Your brain is not simply a passive receiver of flavour. It is a prediction machine. It learns patterns and then tries to get ahead of them. If sweetness has repeatedly arrived with useful calories, emotional comfort, social pleasure, or relief from stress, the brain starts building a model. The model does not need to be conscious. It just needs to become reliable enough that the next cue can trigger expectation. The sight of a familiar wrapper, the smell of baked goods, the end of dinner, even the sound of a kettle can become part of a chain that points forward to something sweet. By the time the craving is felt, the learning has often been underway for years. What makes the whole system so persistent is that it was never designed to be casually switched off. There was no great evolutionary pressure to create an adult human who would one day rise above sweetness and say, "Thank you, but I have transcended the banana." Quite the opposite. Sweet preference remained useful across the lifespan. Childhood is especially energy hungry, of course, but adults also benefit from a system that notices and values accessible fuel. Ancestral life was not a stable office job with climate control, takeaway coffee, and a drawer full of protein bars. It involved uncertainty, physical effort, infection, weather, scarcity, pregnancy, lactation, seasonal shifts, and the possibility that a good food opportunity might not return soon. Under those conditions, continuing to like sweetness was not immaturity, it was sensible continuity. This is why the language people use around sugar can be a bit misleading. They often talk about cravings as though an adult brain ought, by rights, to have become more reasonable, more detached, more nutritionally philosophical. But the adult brain is still the same basic organ, carrying forward ancient priorities with a few extra layers of planning and social embarrassment. It has more executive control than a child's brain, certainly. The frontal regions involved in self-regulation, long-term thinking, and behavioral restraint are more developed. Yet those newer systems do not replace the older motivational architecture. They sit on top of it, negotiate with it, and sometimes lose the argument. You're not a coldly rational being occasionally interrupted by appetite. You're an animal with a highly developed cortex trying to manage a body that still runs on older incentives. That is one reason sweet foods can feel peculiarly persuasive, even when you're perfectly aware of the long-term downsides of eating too much of them. Knowledge and motivation are not the same system. A person can know all about blood glucose, insulin, dental caries, calorie density, and processed foods, and still find themselves standing in the kitchen at night searching cupboards with the dedication of an archaeologist. The informational part of the mind and the reward-seeking part are related but not identical. One deals in understanding. The other deals in salience, urgency, expectation, memory, and immediate payoff. If the reward system has learned that sweetness matters, that learning does not simply evaporate because you listen to a nutrition podcast. There is another feature of sweet preference that deserves attention. It is not static. The brain's response to sweetness can be shaped by repeated exposure, by deprivation, by metabolic state, by sleep, by stress, and by the overall pattern of someone's diet. In other words, the sweet tooth is not fixed like eye colour. It is more like a living habit loop built on top of an ancient tendency. Some people are more sensitive to sweet taste than others. Some need stronger sweetness to feel satisfied because they are accustomed to highly sweetened foods. Some find that after weeks of eating fewer processed sweets, ordinary foods begin tasting sweeter than before. A strawberry starts behaving less like a polite fruit and more like an actual event. That shift is not imaginary. Perception and reward both adapt. Still, adaptation does not erase the original preference. It just changes the threshold and the context. This is why people sometimes feel confused when they have cut down on sugar, and yet still think about it often. The biological machinery remains in place. The learned associations remain in place. Even when exposure drops, the brain may continue anticipating sweetness in familiar situations because those predictions were built through repetition. A reduction in intake can weaken the loop over time, but the weakening is usually gradual. The brain must be retrained by many ordinary experiences in which the old cue appears, and the old reward either does not follow or is replaced by something else. That is less dramatic than a detox fantasy. But it is how learning actually works. The early roots of this preference also help explain why sweetness can feel emotionally comforting in a way other tastes do not always manage. Sweet foods are often present in childhood during moments of reward, celebration, soothing, and care. Birthday cakes, holiday desserts, treats from parents or grandparents, a biscuit after school, something sweet when unwell, something sweet to stop tears, something sweet because it is Friday, or because the trip was long, or because adults are tired and negotiating peace. These experiences are not trivial. The brain stores them. Over time, sweetness can become entangled not only with energy but with safety, attention, relief and belonging. So when an adult reaches for sugar under stress, part of what may be active is not simply hunger but memory, pattern, and the old logic that sweet things arrive when comfort is needed. That does not mean sugar is a substitute for love, though the marketing departments have certainly tried that theory out for years. It means the brain is associative. It links events that occur together, especially when those events are emotionally marked. If sweetness and soothing were often paired, the pairing becomes easier to reactivate later. And because modern adult life contains no shortage of fatigue, pressure, boredom, and mild emotional abrasion, there are many opportunities for those old links to wake back up. A difficult day does not have to be traumatic to change what food sounds appealing. Sometimes simple depletion is enough. A stressed brain looks for efficient reward. Sweet foods are very good at presenting themselves as efficient reward. This tendency becomes even stronger when the body is running on too little energy or too little rest. Sleep deprivation alters appetite regulation in several ways. It can increase hunger signals, reduce satiety sensitivity, and amplify the attraction of highly palatable foods. The tired brain is not generally interested in noble restraint. It wants easy return on investment. Stress does something similar, though by somewhat different routes. Under chronic stress, the body and brain begin valuing immediate relief more heavily. Reward becomes more tempting. Comfort becomes more urgent. Planning becomes more effortful. In that state, the sweet tooth does not feel childish at all. It feels practical, almost intelligent, because it offers a quick shift in sensation and mood. Brief, yes. Imperfect, certainly. But quick. What is striking is how often people misread this as personal inconsistency. They say, "I was doing so well and then suddenly I ruined it." Yet from the brain's point of view, there may have been nothing sudden about it. Poor sleep, a long work day, inadequate meals earlier on, emotional strain, easy access to snacks, old routines, familiar cues, and a built-in sweet preference all converged. By the evening, the outcome had been heavily prepared. The final decision in the kitchen feels like the whole story because it is the visible moment. In reality, it was the last small step in a much longer biological sequence. Even the phrase sweet tooth can be slightly misleading, because the tooth has very little to do with it. Teeth merely pay the bill later. The action is in the brain, and the brain is not choosing sweetness out of ignorance. It is choosing from a menu of priorities that includes energy, pleasure, learning, comfort, and habit. Once we see it that way, the problem becomes less about suppressing a childish preference and more about understanding how adult life keeps activating a system that never disappeared. Your brain did not mature past sweetness, because there was never much survival value in maturing past sweetness. What changed was the world around it. The signals became more concentrated, the portions became larger, the access became constant, the marketing became clever, the occasions multiplied. There is also a social dimension here that often goes unnoticed. Adults are encouraged to consume sweet foods in all sorts of respectable contexts. They are offered at meetings, handed around at birthdays, brought into workplaces, given as gifts, included in celebrations, attached to holidays, and presented as rewards for effort. Very few people are socially pressured into eating a bowl of lentils to mark a promotion. Cake, however, appears the moment a printer works correctly for 3 consecutive days. The brain learns from social approval too. If a food is tied not just to pleasure, but to shared ritual and positive interaction, its motivational value grows. Sugar becomes part of belonging. That makes restraint more complex than a simple nutritional choice. Then there is the issue of novelty. The brain likes predictable rewards, but it also notices variation. The modern sweet food environment is excellent at supplying both. Familiar chocolates are always there, but so are seasonal specials, limited editions, new flavours, soft centres, crunchy coatings, salted caramel inventions, and desserts that seem to have been designed by committees with no interest in moderation. This matters because novelty itself can amplify attention and reward. The sweet tooth that never outgrew its basic preference now lives in a world that constantly refreshes the stimulus. One does not merely have access to sweetness, one has access to an endlessly updated catalogue of sweetness. By now you can probably see the awkward brilliance of the arrangement. A deeply rooted biological preference meets a culture and food system built to intensify, multiply and normalise it. No one needed to train the human species to like sweet taste from scratch. The preference was already there. Modern food production simply learned how to work with it more efficiently than any orchard or beehive ever could. And because the original preference begins so early in life, it can feel intimate, almost like personality. People say, "I've always had a sweet tooth," as though they are confessing a private trait. In one sense they are. In another, they are describing a broadly human inheritance that has been personalised by habit and circumstance. That inheritance is not destiny, but it is the ground on which later habits are built. Some people can keep sweet foods around without much trouble. Others find that regular exposure keeps the wanting active. Some are especially vulnerable when tired, some when stressed, some after meals, some in the late afternoon when energy and patience both start behaving unreliably. These differences matter, but the underlying theme stays the same. The adult brain has not failed to outgrow sweetness. It has continued treating sweetness as meaningful, and modern life keeps giving it reasons to do so. Once you accept that, the goal changes. Instead of demanding that the brain stop finding sugar attractive, which is about as realistic as demanding that knees stop noticing stairs, it becomes more sensible to ask under what conditions the attraction becomes loudest. Which cues wake it up? Which routines feed it? Which states make it harder to regulate? Which foods leave you calmer afterward? And which ones only restart the loop? That is a more useful line of inquiry because it respects the biology, rather than pretending it ought to be absent. And there is one more detail to keep in mind before we widen the frame further. A sweet preference would not have been nearly so powerful in the environments where it first evolved if sweetness had been available everywhere, every day, in concentrated shelf-stable form. The appeal was ancient, yes, but the abundance is new. The sweet tooth is old, the pantry is modern. The brain never asked to outgrow sweetness because, for most of human history, it did not need to. What it needed was to recognise sweet opportunities when they appeared, make good use of them, and carry on in a world where those opportunities were limited enough to manage themselves. That difference between an old appetite and a new environment is where the picture starts to sharpen, because the human body did not develop in a world arranged like a modern kitchen. It did not evolve around cupboards full of shelf-stable snacks, bright wrappers, dessert yogurts that sound like health food, cereals that flirt openly with cake, or sauces carrying enough sugar to make a berry blush. It evolved in settings where getting energy took work, where food availability changed with season and place, and where intense sweetness was not something you casually bumped into 3 times before lunch. The basic hunger is ancient. The surroundings that now answer it are not. It is easy to forget just how unusual this is, because familiarity can make almost anything feel natural. A freezer full of ice cream seems ordinary if you grew up with one. A biscuit tin on the counter seems harmless if it has always been there. Soft drinks in vending machines, pastries at train stations, sweets near the checkout, dessert menus as standard equipment. These all begin to look like background features of life, rather than very recent additions to the human story. Yet from a biological perspective, they are astonishing. For most of our species' time on Earth, a person did not have permanent access to concentrated sweetness at arm's length. Now many people live in spaces where something sweet can be found in under a minute, often without leaving the room. The nervous system notices that, not with a formal announcement of course, but through repeated exposure and learning. An environment rich in food cues changes how often the brain is prompted to think about food. The old systems responsible for seeking energy were built to respond when useful opportunities appeared. If opportunities are suddenly everywhere, then the seeking system is activated more often. This is one reason cravings can feel so frequent in modern life. It is not only that foods are more rewarding, it is that the number of reminders has multiplied. The brain is being tapped on the shoulder all day long. Consider what an ordinary kitchen represents. Even in a fairly restrained household, it might contain bread, fruit, juice, yogurt, jam, breakfast cereals, sauces, granola bars, biscuits, perhaps some chocolate set aside for guests who never quite arrive, maybe ice cream, maybe leftovers, maybe a loaf cake that was bought with the phrase "this will last all week" and then encountered serious resistance by Tuesday. None of this is shocking. None of it would qualify as extreme. But put together it forms a very dense cluster of edible possibility. A person does not have to be starving to become mentally occupied by such an environment. They only have to walk through it at the wrong time with the wrong level of tiredness. That matters because hunger in real life is rarely a clean signal. It does not appear in a laboratory vacuum where only calories are at issue. It arrives in bodies that have slept too little, rushed through meals, sat through meetings, worried about money, scrolled through unpleasant news, argued with partners, carried children, worked shifts and forgotten where they left their keys. Into that setting comes the modern kitchen, ready to offer fast, simple, reliable comfort. The ancient appetite sees available energy. The modern brain also sees relief, reward, and convenience. Those meanings stack on top of each other, which makes the pull stronger than old hunger alone would have been. Convenience is one of the most underestimated parts of the story. Human beings often speak as though choices are mainly governed by values or intentions, but friction shapes behaviour constantly. If the sweetest, most calorie-dense foods require the least effort, they are more likely to be eaten, especially when mental energy is low. A banana may be quick enough, but a packaged snack is quicker. A bowl of oats can be sensible, but a frosted bar asks much less of a person whose day has already been irritating. Evolution did not prepare us for a world in which highly rewarding foods would also be the least demanding. Historically, there was often a trade-off. Honey required risk. Fruit might involve travel, seasonality, or climbing. Tubers required digging. Grains required processing. Effort helped regulate intake simply by existing. Modern food technology has been very effective at removing that effort. It has also been very effective at refining taste signals. Many processed foods do not just contain sugar. They combine sugar with fat, salt, soft textures, engineered crunch, strong aromas, and the kind of easy chewability that lets a person consume a surprising amount while barely interrupting conversation. From the point of view of appetite systems, this can be extremely persuasive. Such foods are not merely sweet. They are designed to be easy to like, easy to repeat, and easy to keep eating. A very modern kitchen does not only contain energy, it often contains energy that has been made unusually efficient at getting attention. The efficiency begins before the food is even eaten. Packaging works as a cue, advertising works as a cue, habitual placement works as a cue. A transparent jar on the counter is a cue. A family ritual is a cue. The route from the sofa to the fridge can become a cue. The brain learns these patterns with irritating competence. If sweet food often appears after dinner, then dinner itself can begin to predict it. If something sugary is usually eaten during an afternoon break, then the break acquires anticipatory weight. Soon the body may not be responding to need so much as to expectation. A person says, "I always want something sweet after meals," as though this were a mysterious law of nature. when often it is a learned sequence the brain now runs automatically. This is not to say biology is helpless in the face of routine, but routine matters. Appetite systems are trainable, repeated pairings become easier to trigger, and the modern kitchen makes repetition simple because it preserves foods that once would have been seasonal, fragile, or laborious. Fruit can arrive year-round from faraway climates. Desserts can sit frozen for months. Snack foods can wait patiently in cupboards without spoiling. Syrups, spreads, bars, biscuits, sweetened drinks, instant puddings, all of them store beautifully compared with the fleeting sweetness of a ripe fig in a difficult landscape. The old appetite may still be working on ancient assumptions about rarity. The room around it is operating on supply chains, refrigeration, industrial food chemistry, and 24-hour retail logic. Another part of the mismatch is portion size. When sweetness was naturally occurring, it often came bundled with limits. A handful of berries is not infinite. A piece of fruit has volume, fibre, and a stopping point built into its physical form. Honey is calorie-dense, yes, but historically it was not exactly lying around in easy, pre-measured drizzle bottles, with cartoon bees smiling encouragingly from the label. Modern portions have detached sweetness from many of those natural breaks. A bottle can hold several servings but look like one. A packet designed for sharing can meet a lone person on a Tuesday evening and lose the argument completely. A dessert sold as an individual treat may contain more sugar than the body was ever likely to encounter in one sitting under natural conditions. The appetite system, meanwhile, still responds at the level of taste, learning, and immediate reward. It is not equipped with an internal historian whispering, "This amount would have startled a Paleolithic berry gatherer." The pace of eating has changed too. Many modern sweet foods can be consumed rapidly, which means reward arrives before satiety has much chance to catch up. Signals of fullness exist, but they are not instant. Hormones, stomach stretch, nutrient sensing, all of these take some time to register. If a food is soft, refined, and fast to swallow, it can slip a good distance into the body before the slower systems begin making their case. This is one reason sugary drinks are such efficient troublemakers. They carry energy, often a great deal of it, without demanding much chewing or producing the same sense of fullness as more solid foods. An ancient appetite looking for useful calories would have considered that a remarkable bargain. A modern person trying not to overconsume may find it less charming. There is also the issue of predictability. Wild food environments are variable by nature. Some days yield more than others. Weather interferes, seasons interfere, competition interferes. Modern kitchens, by contrast, are stable. If you buy the same cereal each week, it tastes the same each week. The biscuit never ripens too early. The chocolate does not come with thorns. The reward is consistent, and consistency is powerful in learning. The brain likes a dependable payoff. A food that tastes almost exactly as expected every time becomes a reliable target for craving, especially when paired with particular moods or times of day. Nature offered sweetness as an event. Industry often offers it as a guarantee. Then there is the psychological ease of replacement. In older food environments, failure had consequences. If one food source was unavailable, another might require different skills, different routes, different timing. In a modern kitchen, by contrast, one sweet option can stand in for another. No ice cream, there are biscuits. No biscuits. Jam on toast, no jam. Sweet yogurt, no yogurt. Breakfast cereal. The details may differ, but the general reward profile remains close enough that the craving can often be satisfied by a substitute. This gives the appetite system resilience. It does not need perfect conditions. It only needs something sweet enough, fast enough, available enough. Many kitchens can provide a backup plan within seconds. Social life strengthens the arrangement further. Families build routines around treats. Households create default foods. Some people grow up in homes where dessert follows dinner almost automatically, where affection is shown through baking, where refusing a sweet offering feels faintly ungrateful, or where stress sends everyone toward the same cupboard. None of this is sinister. Food is deeply social. But it means a modern kitchen is not just storage space. It is also memory, ritual, convenience, habit, and family culture. Ancient hunger walks into that room and encounters far more than nutrients. It encounters the emotional history of the household. This helps explain why two kitchens with similar amounts of food can produce very different experiences. In one home, sweets are present, but not especially charged. In another, they are tightly linked to reward, scarcity, conflict, secrecy, or comfort. The biology is shared, but the learned meaning differs. A person who grew up hearing "don't touch that," that's for later may develop one relationship with sweet foods. Someone who grew up with open access may develop another. Someone whose treats were used to manage emotion may carry that pattern forward. By adulthood, the kitchen is never just a room. It is a training ground the brain has been studying for years. The modern kitchen also dissolves the boundary between hunger and entertainment. Historically, eating and acquiring food were often bound up with necessity and effort. Today, food is also leisure, distraction, hobby, visual media, reward, and background activity. People eat while watching screens, while driving, while working, while celebrating, while recovering from difficult conversations, while procrastinating, while pretending not to procrastinate, and while browsing recipes for meals they have no intention of cooking tonight. This matters because attention changes intake. When eating is folded into other activities, the body's satiety signals may receive less notice, while the rewarding qualities of food continue doing their work. A sweet snack consumed absent-mindedly can still strengthen a habit loop quite efficiently. Marketing intensifies all of this by speaking directly to the old appetite in modern language. Products are framed as deserved, comforting, energizing, wholesome, indulgent, or somehow both clean and decadent at the same time, which is an impressive rhetorical trick. The message is rarely, "Here is sugar in another form." Instead, it is fuel, treat, boost, balance, reward, self-care, premium pleasure, artisanal nostalgia, or a little something for you because the world has been terribly demanding, and this pudding understands. These messages do not create the sweet preference from nothing, but they do help organize behavior around it. They place sweet foods inside narratives that make consumption feel timely and justified. It is worth pausing on self-care, because that word has done remarkable work in recent years. There are forms of self-care that are genuinely restorative: sleep, boundaries, movement, social support, decent meals, medical care, rest without guilt. And then there is the smaller commercial version, in which a very sweet coffee drink and a pastry are presented as emotional treatment. The reason this message lands is not that people are foolish. It lands because the body does often interpret sugar as a quick reward, and modern life does often leave people depleted. An ancient appetite for energy gets translated into a modern ritual of coping. The kitchen becomes not just a place to eat, but a place to repair the day, however briefly. This does not mean the answer is to banish every pleasant food and live in a refrigerator of disciplined sorrow. Humans are not improved by turning meals into moral examinations. The point is simpler. Old drives are easier to understand when you see the environment they now operate inside. A person who feels constantly tempted by sugar in a modern kitchen is not revealing a uniquely defective character. They're showing what happens when a highly adaptable foraging brain is placed in a steady landscape of cues, convenience, concentrated reward, and repeated emotional associations. The appetite makes sense. The difficulty makes sense too. There is a tendency in diet culture to imagine that good choices should feel easy once a person knows enough. But knowledge does not cancel environment. A well-informed brain is still a brain. It still responds to sight, smell, timing, stress, and habit. It still tracks reward. It still makes use of whatever is nearest when energy and patience both begin to drop. This is why so much sensible advice fails when it treats eating as a purely intellectual problem. It says choose better, without examining the room in which the choice is being made. Yet a very modern kitchen is not neutral territory. It is an active participant in behaviour. Even the simple visibility of food changes intake. Put biscuits in a cupboard and they compete with memory. Put them in a clear jar on the counter and they compete with eyesight several dozen times a day. Leave fruit washed and visible, and it has a better chance than fruit hidden at the back of a drawer, beneath a melancholy cucumber and a container of something no one can identify. These are not minor details. Ancient hunger was always shaped by what could be seen, smelled, reached, and remembered. The modern kitchen still obeys those rules. It just does so with better packaging and more light. And underneath all this is the central mismatch that keeps returning. The appetite system evolved to treat sweetness as meaningful, partly because the world made it scarce enough to matter. Scarcity sharpened attention. Effort limited overuse. Seasonality imposed breaks. The body did not need to become indifferent to sweetness because reality already provided limits. In modern kitchens, those limits have weakened. Sweetness can appear daily, hourly, almost continuously if a person wants it to. The old signal is still potent, but the old breaks are missing or reduced. That is why the question is not merely why people like sugar. Humans have always liked sugar. The sharper question is what happens when an ancient preference for calorie-rich sweetness moves into a domestic environment built around storage, convenience, abundance, and endless repeatability. What happens is exactly what you would expect from a nervous system trying to do its job under strange new conditions. It notices, it learns, it anticipates, it asks again. And because the modern kitchen is so good at answering yes, the asking can become part of daily life. To see just how powerful that old signal really is, though, we have to move back before the cupboards and labels and dessert aisles into a time when sweetness was not common at all, when finding it could genuinely change the day, and when the body had every reason to pay close attention the moment it appeared. To see why sweetness can still command so much attention, it helps to leave the modern kitchen behind for a while and imagine the much older conditions under which the human body learned to care about it. In those settings, a sweet taste was not ordinary background noise, it was information. It was one of those small, useful discoveries that could alter what happened next, because it often meant that energy was available in a form the body could use quickly and safely. That mattered in a world where calories were not guaranteed, where food quality varied, where effort cost energy of its own, and where the difference between a rich patch of edible plants and an unproductive day was not theoretical. When we talk about ancient human life, there is always a temptation to make it either too noble or too miserable. In truth, it was neither. It was practical. People lived inside ecological realities that changed with weather, season, geography, and luck. Food came from landscapes, not packaging. It had to be found, gathered, hunted, processed, carried, protected, and shared. Some days would have gone well, others would not. In that setting, a food that was both energy-rich and pleasant to eat had obvious value. There was no need for a philosophical debate about whether sweetness was too tempting. Tempting was useful. Tempting helped motivate action. Tempting helped direct attention toward things worth collecting while they were available. One of the simplest examples is ripe fruit. A ripe fruit is not just sugar floating alone in nature. It is also a sign. Ripeness means timing. Too early, and the fruit may be hard, bitter, starchy, or nutritionally less useful. Too late, and it may spoil, be eaten by other animals, fall, rot, or become less desirable. Sweetness helps signal that a narrow window is opened. The plant, of course, has its own interests. By making ripe fruit attractive, it encourages animals to eat it and spread seeds elsewhere. But from the animal's side, including ours, the arrangement is efficient. The taste system rewards attention to foods that are ready and often worth the effort. Life takes notice because there is something to notice. That signal becomes even more important when you remember how expensive the brain is. Human brains consume a remarkable amount of energy relative to their size. They are not passive ornaments. They are metabolically costly organs that rely heavily on glucose. The body can make glucose from several sources, and humans are metabolically flexible, but that does not change the fact that quick carbohydrate sources would have been useful whenever they were available. A sweet food did not merely taste pleasant, it represented an opportunity to support a demanding nervous system in a world that offered no guarantees. That makes the attraction look less like indulgence and more like efficient design. Children help make this point visible. Across cultures, young humans usually show strong interest in sweet tastes, often stronger than adults. That is sometimes treated as evidence of poor judgment, but from a biological standpoint it makes excellent sense. Childhood is a period of growth, development, learning, and heavy energy demand. A system that drives children toward calorie-rich, safe foods is not badly designed. It is doing what selection likely favoured. Adults retain that basic preference, but children often display it more openly because they have fewer social layers covering it up. They have not yet learned to discuss cake in the restrained language of just a little something nice after dinner. They simply recognise value and announce it with startling honesty. Honey offers another revealing case. For much of human history, honey would have been an extraordinary prize. It is intensely sweet, calorie-dense, and memorable. It is also not usually obtained without trouble. Bees are not famous for their indifference. Finding honey in the wild requires skill, opportunity, and willingness to manage risk. Yet humans across many times and places have clearly valued it enormously. That tells you something about how meaningful concentrated sweetness could be in a world where it was rare. A resource does not become culturally prominent by accident. When gathering it involves stings, climbing, smoke, and determination. It becomes prominent because the reward is worth the effort. The same broad principle applies to other naturally sweet foods, though in different forms. Tubers, roots, seeds, grains, and various plant foods can all provide carbohydrates, but sweetness carries a special immediacy because it can often be detected before digestion even begins. The body does not need to wait for a long metabolic report. The tongue gives an advanced signal that this food may contain accessible energy. That speed matters. Organisms do better when they can make useful judgments quickly. Sweet taste helps provide one of those judgments. It is not a full nutritional analysis, but it does not have to be. In nature, approximate rules that work often are better than perfect rules that arrive too late. Of course, sweetness did not exist in isolation from other sensory and ecological clues. Smell, texture, colour, familiarity, prior experience and social learning would all have influenced what people ate. No ancient human wandered through the world guided by sweetness alone like a moth with a dessert problem. But sweetness did provide a strong piece of evidence. In many natural contexts, it helped distinguish foods worth eating from foods not yet ready or not worth the trouble. This is one reason bitter taste developed its own importance as a kind of caution signal. If sweet said perhaps safe energy, bitter often said proceed carefully. The taste system was never intended to deliver pleasure for its own sake. Pleasure was the mechanism by which useful choices became more likely. That arrangement worked especially well because sweetness was limited. If a valuable resource is rare, then a built-in preference for it becomes adaptive without becoming excessive. The world itself imposes moderation. One can only eat the berries that are there. One can only raid the hive one has found. One can only harvest what the season provides. Effort, distance, competition, spoilage, and timing all work as restraints. The appetite says yes, but reality decides how often yes can happen. This is a crucial part of the story, because it explains why ancient preference was not necessarily a problem under ancient conditions. The body could value sweetness highly precisely because the environment would not endlessly exploit that value. Seasonality deserves more attention here than it usually gets. In many ecosystems, sweet foods appear in bursts rather than in a smooth year-round stream. Fruits ripen according to local patterns. Honey depends on ecological conditions. Even starchy plant foods vary in availability and labour. That means a sweet opportunity may be especially significant because it is temporary. Temporariness changes behaviour. Humans are quite capable of responding strongly to resources that are available now but may not remain so. In that sense, the attraction to sweetness is not only about what the food is, but also about when it appears. A ripe, sweet food in season is a chance not to be wasted. Animals beyond humans show similar logic. Many species respond strongly to sweetness, or seek out energy-rich foods when they can. They are not morally weak. They are organisms operating inside systems where energy acquisition matters. This broader biological context should make the human situation feel less strange. Our preference is not some bizarre modern accident. It is a variation on a very common pattern in life. Organisms evolve ways of detecting valuable resources and become motivated to pursue them. The exact details differ by species and ecology, but the rule is familiar. What matters for humans is how that ancient rule behaves once the resource is no longer rare. Another important point is that natural sweet foods often arrive bundled with other characteristics that shape intake. Fruit contains water, fibre, bulk, and variable levels of sugar depending on species and ripeness. Eating it usually takes time, chewing is required, the stomach fills, the reward is real, but the package imposes limits. Even honey, for all its concentration, was not generally consumed as an endlessly available drizzle over everything in sight. Natural access patterns, physical form and effort all created structure. Life noticed sweetness, certainly, but not in the same way a modern brain notices a cupboard full of individually wrapped sweets designed to be eaten while standing up. This is why it is misleading when people suggest that because sugar exists in nature, the modern abundance of added sugar must somehow be perfectly aligned with our biology. Existence in nature and concentration in the food supply are not the same thing. Salt exists in nature too, but no one pretends that makes every ultra-processed snack a model of ancestral harmony. Natural context matter, amounts matter, frequency matters. The body's preference evolved under one set of conditions, not under all imaginable conditions. Sweetness in a rare fig or a seasonal berry patch is not biologically equivalent to sweetness dissolved into drinks, hidden in sauces, layered into breakfast foods, and made continuously available. This mismatch becomes clearer if you think about how the brain learns from salience. Rare, high-value events are memorable. They stand out. They shape future attention. In ancient settings, a sweet discovery would often have that quality. It would be notable without being constant. The brain could learn, remember, and seek it without being bombarded by it every few hours. There is a big difference between a motivational system built to notice occasional opportunity and a motivational system forced to negotiate with permanent abundance. The first arrangement encourages useful action. The second can create repetitive noise, because the signal never really stops. It is also likely that sweet foods once carried a stronger contrast against the general background of diet. If daily food is plain, variable, fibrous, or hard-won, then sweetness stands out sharply. The sensory contrast itself adds to value. A modern diet, by comparison, often contains sweetness in low to moderate amounts all over the place. Bread can be sweetened, yogurt can be sweetened. Sauces, dressings, cereals, drinks, snack bars, baked goods, all can contribute. The contrast becomes strange. Sweetness is both everywhere and still capable of feeling special when intensified. The brain gets trained to expect it more often, while still responding strongly to bigger doses. That is a difficult combination from a regulatory point of view. There is a social side to rarity as well. Foods that are hard to obtain often gain importance within communities. They may be shared, celebrated, remembered, traded, or protected. A rare sweet food could become more than nutrition. It could become occasion. It could mark cooperation or luck. This may help explain why sweetness remains so closely tied to celebration in modern life. Even though sugar is now common, We still treat sweet foods as markers of birthdays, holidays, success, courtship, hospitality, and reward. Somewhere inside our cultural habits may be the echo of a much older truth. A sweet thing once meant something had gone well. The body, of course, does not care about symbolism in the abstract. It cares about physiology. Yet symbolism changes behavior, and behavior changes physiology. If a sweet food signals celebration, then the brain learns to pair it with positive arousal, social connection, and memory. That makes the food more salient. Even when abundance arrives later, the older emotional logic remains easy to activate. This is another reason sweetness can feel disproportionately important compared with its nutritional simplicity. It is not just energy, it is energy plus meaning, layered over thousands of ordinary and extraordinary moments. There is also the fact that hunger itself feels different when food is uncertain. In modern settings, many people experience appetite against a background assumption that food can be obtained soon. In ancient settings, uncertainty would have been much more real. That uncertainty would give added weight to opportunities for calorie intake. The body does not need to be starving for this to matter. Even moderate unpredictability can shift how valuable energy-rich foods feel. An organism facing uncertain access has reason to take useful calories seriously when they appear. Under those conditions, sweetness is not a luxury signal, it is a practical one. What makes all this so relevant now is that the body retains much of that practical logic. It still interprets sweetness as a clue worth following. The neural pathways involved in reward, motivation, learning, and appetite did not arise in supermarkets. They arose in ecological conditions where good cues mattered. Life took notice because not noticing would have been costly. Missing a ripe fruit patch, ignoring honey, or failing to value accessible carbohydrate when energy was needed did not display admirable restraint. It displayed poor strategy. This does not mean every ancient human constantly chased sugar with modern obsession. That would oversimplify the picture. Human diets were diverse. Many populations relied heavily on starchy staples, animal foods, nuts, seeds, roots, legumes, and whatever local ecology made possible. Sweetness was only one thread in a large nutritional fabric, but when it appeared, it was useful enough and pleasant enough to merit attention. The key point is not exclusivity, it is significance. Sweetness did not need to dominate the diet to shape the nervous system. It only needed to be consistently valuable when present. And because it was valuable, the body became good at learning from it. That is the part modern environments still exploit so efficiently. A rare, rewarding food teaches the brain to remember. It says this mattered before, so notice it next time. Under ancient conditions, that learning was a strength. Under modern conditions, the same strength can become cumbersome, because next time arrives constantly. The old machinery is trying to help, but the world keeps presenting it with more sweetness than it was built to sort through. There is one more quiet feature of rarity that deserves notice. Rare rewards do not just motivate pursuit, they also leave room between encounters. That space matters. It gives the system time to reset. It prevents the cue from becoming a non-stop hum. Modern life removes much of that spacing. The body can move from sweet breakfast to sweet coffee to sweet snack to sweet dessert without ever fully leaving the territory. Ancient life was less likely to produce that pattern, at least not consistently. The motivational signal therefore remained linked to actual opportunity rather than permanent availability. Once you understand that, the old preference stops looking irrational. Sweetness was rare enough, useful enough, and limited enough that a strong biological interest in it made excellent sense. Life noticed because life benefited from noticing. The real puzzle is not why the body learned this lesson so well. The real puzzle is what happens once a lesson built for scarcity is dropped into abundance, once the sweet signal no longer marks occasional opportunity but becomes part of daily background, and once foods begin to appear that can push those ancient circuits harder and more reliably than a handful of ripe fruit ever could. And that is where the modern problem really begins, because the systems that once helped you notice rare value can be trained by repetition far more effectively than most people realize. Not all at once, not in some dramatic moment where the brain announces that it has formed a lasting attachment to chocolate biscuits, but slowly, quietly, one small bite at a time. This is what makes sugar so interesting and so troublesome. It does not need to overwhelm the body in a single grand event. It can work through accumulation, through learning, through small experiences repeated often enough that the brain starts treating them as important patterns rather than isolated pleasures. When people hear the phrase hijacks reward, they sometimes imagine something violent or artificial, as though sugar storms into the brain and takes over by brute force. The reality is subtler and in some ways more effective for being subtle. Sugar works with existing circuits. It does not invent a reward system from scratch. It speaks the language your brain already understands. It arrives as sweetness on the tongue, as fast energy in the body, as relief in a tired afternoon, as comfort at the end of a difficult day, and as an event the brain can easily remember. The so-called hijacking happens because these signals line up neatly with systems that evolved to care about useful outcomes and to learn from them quickly. At the centre of this is reward, though reward in biology is not quite the same thing as reward in ordinary conversation. In ordinary life, a reward is often something given after a task, a sort of bonus or prize. In the brain, reward is broader. It refers to the processes that make certain experiences feel worth repeating. This includes pleasure, certainly, but also motivation, attention, learning, and expectation. A food can be rewarding because it tastes good, because it changes your internal state in a satisfying way, because it has solved a problem before, or because it arrives wrapped in memory and relief. Sugar is unusually good at touching several of these at once. A sweet taste is detected quickly, and the brain begins reacting before a detailed metabolic story has even had time to unfold. The body recognizes that something potentially valuable is on its way. Then, depending on the form in which the sugar arrives, digestion and absorption can move along fairly rapidly too. This is especially true in refined foods where the sugar is not heavily slowed by fiber, protein, or structure. The brain is not only receiving sensory pleasure, it is also learning that the promise of sweetness is often followed by a real physiological payoff, that pairing matters. It helps link the anticipation of sugar with the experience of sugar. Over time, the anticipation itself can become powerful. This is where dopamine enters the picture, and it is worth treating it carefully because dopamine has become one of those scientific words that gets dragged into every conversation until it starts sounding like a mythological creature. Dopamine is not the same thing as pleasure. It is more closely involved in motivation, salience, and learning from reward. It helps the brain notice when something important is happening and adjust future behaviour accordingly. If an outcome turns out better than expected, dopamine signalling helps mark that surprise and encourages learning. If a cue reliably predicts a reward, dopamine responses can start shifting toward the cue itself. The brain begins preparing before the reward arrives. That shift is one of the cleverest and most inconvenient parts of the whole system. At first, a sweet food may simply be pleasant when eaten. But after enough repetition, the brain learns the signs that sugar is coming. The wrapper, the smell, the time of day, the place where you usually sit, the end of a meal, the break between tasks, the drive home, the supermarket aisle, the small silence after children are asleep, all of these can become predictors. Once that happens, wanting can begin well before eating. In fact, it often does. You do not see the chocolate and then neutrally decide whether you would enjoy it. The cue itself may already be nudging your motivational system, making the idea feel more urgent than it would in a completely neutral setting. This is one reason people are often baffled by the intensity of cravings that seem to appear out of nowhere. They are not usually coming out of nowhere. They are being triggered by learned associations that have become efficient enough to feel automatic. A person may say, "I just suddenly needed something sweet," when what actually happened was more like this. The usual time arrived, the usual place appeared, the body was a little tired, stress was slightly elevated, the brain recognized several familiar cues, and the reward system began leaning forward before the conscious mind had fully caught up. The craving feels spontaneous only because the underlying learning has become so fast and familiar. There is also a difference between liking and wanting, and this distinction turns out to be very useful. Liking refers more to the pleasure of the experience itself. Wanting refers more to the motivational pull, the drive to obtain it. In a perfectly tidy world, these would rise and fall together. You would want exactly what you liked, in the amount you liked it, and then stop once the pleasure had done its work. Brains are not always that tidy. Wanting can become stronger through repetition and cues, even when liking stays the same or fades slightly. This is why someone can crave a certain sweet snack with impressive determination, finally eat it, and then think, "That was nice, but honestly not as miraculous as my brain promised." The wanting was amplified more than the pleasure. That gap matters because it helps explain why sugar can keep pulling at behaviour without necessarily delivering increasing satisfaction. The reward system is not built simply to maximise deep contentment. It is built to keep useful behaviours going. If a cue has repeatedly led to a rewarding outcome, the brain learns to pursue it. From an evolutionary perspective, this is efficient. In a modern food environment, it can become awkward. The system keeps generating motivation because that is what it was trained to do, not because each individual cookie represents a profound emotional truth. One small bite at a time is exactly how this training happens. No single encounter has to be remarkable. Repetition does the work. A little something sweet after lunch, a handful of sweets during a stressful project, dessert while watching television most nights, sugary coffee every afternoon, chocolate whenever energy dips. These are ordinary moments, and that is why they matter. The brain is a pattern-detecting machine. It does not require drama. It requires consistency. If a sweet food repeatedly appears in a certain context and produces a predictable reward, the context and the reward become linked. The more often the link is rehearsed, the less effort it takes to activate. The food industry, not by accident, has become very good at producing foods that support exactly this kind of rehearsal. Many sweet foods are designed to be highly palatable, meaning easy to enjoy and easy to continue eating. Palatability is not just about sugar concentration. It is about texture, aroma, fat content, salt balance, mouthfeel, ease of chewing, rate of melting, even the sound of the bite. A sweet food that is also creamy, crunchy, soft in the right places, fragrant and simple to consume, tends to linger in memory more effectively than a plain food that requires work. The more immediately pleasant and frictionless the experience, the more efficiently the reward system can learn from it. And then there is dose. In nature, sweetness often arrives in forms that impose physical limits. In modern processed foods, the dose can be far more concentrated and far more repeatable. A single serving may deliver a large amount of sugar very quickly. A beverage may do so even faster, because liquid calories often move with alarming efficiency and do not always generate the same fullness signals as more solid foods. The faster and more concentrated the reward, the more memorable it can become. The brain notices strong, reliable outcomes. That does not mean sugar is identical to more extreme substances people sometimes compare it to in sensational headlines. Biology is rarely helped by melodrama. But it does mean refined sugar can push reward circuits in ways that are more intense and more frequent than the body would historically have encountered. Habituation complicates things further. The more often a certain level of sweetness is consumed, the more normal it can begin to feel. This does not necessarily mean the food stops being pleasant. It means the brain and palate adjust to what is common. Very sweet foods can gradually become the default reference point. making less sweet foods feel less exciting by comparison. A bowl of berries may once have seemed richly sweet and now seems merely healthy. Plain yogurt may feel stern and judgmental. Tea without sugar may appear to have entered a period of emotional withdrawal. This is not because the foods themselves have changed. It is because the brain calibrates expectation based on repeated experience. That recalibration is one of the quiet ways sugar changes the food landscape inside the mind. It does not only make sweet foods more rewarding, it can also make non-sweet foods feel less immediately compelling, at least for a while. The contrast shifts. The reward system learns what kind of stimulation to expect, and subtler pleasures may not register as strongly until the system has time to readjust. This is why people often discover, after reducing their intake of very sweet foods for a period, that ordinary foods begin to taste better than before. Fruit seems sweeter, nuts seem richer, simple meals seem more satisfying. The reward system has not become purer or morally improved. It has simply changed its expectations. Stress makes the whole process easier to reinforce. Under stress, the brain tends to prioritize immediate, reliable rewards more strongly. Long-term thinking becomes harder. Effort feels more expensive. Comfort becomes more attractive. Sweet foods fit this moment beautifully because they are quick, familiar, and easy to predict. If sugar repeatedly arrives as a way to soften tension, the brain learns not only that it tastes good, but that it functions as relief. This adds another layer to the habit. The food is no longer just rewarding in itself, it becomes a tool for changing state. Tired becomes less tired, flat becomes less flat, upset becomes briefly buffered, bored becomes occupied. That is very potent learning. The same is true for fatigue. When people are tired, especially chronically tired, the appeal of fast energy rises. Now, whether sugar truly fixes tiredness is another matter. Often it offers only a brief improvement followed by further instability. But the reward system is heavily influenced by what happens in the moment. If a sweet snack reliably produces a noticeable lift, however temporary, the brain logs that as useful. The longer-term cost may be vague and delayed. The immediate change is obvious. In learning systems, obvious tends to beat vague. That is another reason just use willpower is such unhelpful advice. Willpower is being asked to negotiate with a system that has recorded numerous short-term benefits. It is not arguing with empty temptation. It is arguing with learned expectations of pleasure, relief, and reward. And because these expectations are cued automatically, a person often begins the argument already tired. This does not mean self-regulation is impossible. It means it works better when it respects the biology. Reduce the cues, stabilize meals, improve sleep, lower exposure, build new routines, and the reward system gradually learns different expectations. But none of that happens because the sweet food was a simple moral failure. It happens because repeated learning can be reshaped only by more repeated learning. There is also a fascinating effect known as reward prediction. Once the brain is used to getting sugar in certain situations, it begins anticipating the reward before it arrives. If the reward appears as expected, the system hums along. If it does not, something like dissatisfaction or tension may arise. This is part of why cravings can feel annoying even when you're not especially hungry. The brain is not always asking for energy. Sometimes it is protesting the interruption of a familiar predicted reward. You finished dinner and the brain expected dessert. You sat on the sofa and the brain expected chocolate. You started a work break and the brain expected a sweet coffee. When the expected reward does not come, the absence itself can become noticeable. People often interpret that discomfort as proof that they genuinely need sugar, when often what they are feeling is the friction of a prediction not being fulfilled. This distinction is useful because it shows why cravings can fade if the routine changes consistently. The brain eventually updates its model. If dessert stops following dinner for long enough, dinner loses some of its predictive pull. If the work break is repeatedly paired with a different routine, the original cue weakens, but there is no dramatic switch. The update occurs through repetition. The the same way the original learning was built. Another quiet feature of sugar's pull is its compatibility with distraction. Many sweet foods can be eaten quickly, absent-mindedly, almost as background behaviour. This reduces the chance that satiety or satisfaction will be fully registered. The food is consumed, the reward system gets its cue-reward pairing, but the conscious experience may be oddly thin. That can leave room for more wanting later. A person may finish a bag of sweets while watching something and hardly remember the sequence in detail, only the vague sense that the hand kept returning until the packet was empty. The learning still happened. The reward still counted. But the awareness of what was satisfying and what was merely automatic may have been blurred. It is worth noting that sugar does not act alone in many of the foods people crave most intensely. It often appears with fat, refined starch, flavour compounds and textures designed to enhance pleasure. A plain spoonful of table sugar has one kind of reward profile. A biscuit, pastry, chocolate bar or dessert has another. The combinations matter. Sugar can amplify palatability, but it is often the full package that becomes especially reinforcing. This is why some people say they do not crave sweetness in general so much as specific foods. They are not longing for sugar in the abstract. They are longing for the precise sensory and emotional profile of a familiar item that has earned a privileged place in the reward system. And this is why moderation can feel strangely easy with some sweet foods and astonishingly hard with others. The brain does not respond equally to all forms of sugar. Context, texture, concentration, memory, habit, emotional state, and accompanying ingredients all shape the experience. A ripe peach may be lovely and satisfying. A box of frosted pastries may activate a very different pattern of wanting. Both contain sweetness, but they do not train the brain in the same way. One arrives with water, fibre, perishability, and a natural stopping point. The other arrives engineered for convenience, repeatability, and sensory punch. Still, the deepest reason sugar can seem to hijack reward is simply that the brain learns efficiently from repeated reward, especially when the reward is fast, reliable, and easy to predict. Sugar fits those conditions extremely well. The repeated bite teaches the next bite teaches the cue teaches the craving teaches the routine. Soon a whole behavioural loop exists that feels personal and inevitable, even though it was built through many ordinary moments that each seem too small to matter. That is the maddening part for many people. The loop can be strengthened by things that look trivial. One sweet coffee every afternoon. One dessert while streaming a show each night. A little chocolate whenever work becomes irritating. None of these sounds like the foundation of a robust reward pattern, yet the brain does not care whether a habit sounds dramatic. It cares whether it is repeated. Small actions done often become influential precisely because they become predictable. One small bite at a time is not a figure of speech here. It is the mechanism. Over time, though, the reward is not the whole story. Sugar can make you feel lifted and then leave you flatter. It can satisfy and then sharpen the desire again. It can solve a dip in energy and then help create another one. To understand why the wanting so often returns, sometimes not long after the pleasure itself, we have to follow what happens next, after the sweet taste, after the reward signal, when the body begins dealing with the rise, the crash, and the very inconvenient habit of craving again. The awkward part is that the body does not experience sugar as a single neat event. It experiences it as a sequence. First there is the taste, then the reward, then the absorption, then the metabolic response, then the shift that follows, and somewhere inside that sequence the mind often begins telling a story that is much simpler than the biology actually is. The story usually goes something like this. I wanted sugar, I ate sugar, I enjoyed it, and then later I wanted more. But between those points, a lot is happening. Blood glucose changes, hormones respond, the brain updates its expectations, energy may rise, settle, wobble, or drift. Appetite signals are influenced by what else you ate, how long it has been since your last meal, how much you slept, how stressed you are, and whether the sweet thing arrived as part of a balanced meal or as a quick, isolated hit. The return of craving is not magic. It is the result of several systems moving on slightly different clocks. When people talk about a sugar high, they are usually describing a mix of things rather than one pure physiological event. There may be genuine metabolic effects, especially if the food is rich in fast-digesting carbohydrates and eaten on an emptier stomach. There may also be relief, excitement, anticipation, pleasure, and the mental brightening that comes from getting something you are strongly wanting. Sometimes the rise is partly chemical and partly psychological, which is not a lesser form of reality. Psychological states are biological states. If the brain has been expecting reward and reward finally arrives, that matters. If a sweet snack breaks up fatigue or boredom, that matters too. A person can feel better because blood glucose has risen, because dopamine-linked motivation has been rewarded, because stress has eased for a moment, or because all of these have happened together in a very ordinary but convincing combination. The body's handling of sugar begins quickly enough. Carbohydrates are digested into simpler molecules, including glucose, and glucose enters the bloodstream. In response, the pancreas releases insulin, which helps move glucose into cells and helps regulate how much remains circulating in the blood. None of this is unusual or pathological by itself. It is normal physiology. The body is built to manage incoming energy. Problems tend to arise from context, frequency, quantity, and pattern, rather than from the mere existence of blood glucose rising after a meal. Still, the speed and shape of that rise matter. A sweet food that is highly refined, low in fiber, and eaten rapidly may produce a different experience from carbohydrates that arrive more slowly inside a meal containing protein, fat, and bulk. This difference is important because the brain does not only care that energy arrived, it also reacts to how that arrival feels. A rapid rise can be felt as a noticeable lift, especially if someone was hungry, tired, or underfed earlier in the day. A slower, steadier response may be less dramatic but often more stable. The modern sweet food environment is biased toward drama. Quick reward, quick consumption, quick absorption, and very often a less steady after effect. That does not mean every sugary food leads to a dramatic crash in every person. Human metabolism is more varied than popular advice likes to admit, but it does mean that foods which push the system quickly can create experiences the brain remembers, and what the brain remembers strongly is not always what serves you best later. The so-called crash is often described with more certainty than the biology allows, because not every dip in mood or energy after sugar is literally a dramatic plunge in blood glucose. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's a relative drop from a higher point. Sometimes it is the contrast between reward and the return to normal. Sometimes it is the fact that a sweet snack displaced a more sustaining meal, so genuine hunger returned sooner. Sometimes the person was already tired, stressed, or sleep-deprived, and the brief lift simply faded, revealing the original state again. The body is complex, and the term sugar crash can lump together several different experiences. But whatever the precise mechanism in a given moment, the subjective result is often familiar. The energy or comfort does not last, and the desire for another lift becomes easier to understand. That temporary quality is one reason sugar can be so persuasive without being particularly resolving. It often changes the moment more effectively than it changes the underlying condition. If you're tired because you slept badly, sugar may make the afternoon feel more manageable for a while, but it does not repair sleep debt. If you are stressed because the day has been difficult, sweetness may briefly soften the edge, but it does not remove the source of stress. If you are undernourished because you skipped lunch, a sweet snack may raise energy, but it may not provide the kind of satiety that keeps you stable for long. In each case, the immediate effect can still be real and reinforcing. The problem is not that sugar does nothing. The problem is often that it does something brief. brains learn brilliantly from brief, noticeable improvements. They are less good at being persuaded by delayed costs. This is one of the oldest problems in biology. The system that helps you pursue rewards is weighted toward what can be felt now. If a sweet food reliably produces immediate pleasure or relief, and the drawbacks are postponed, subtle, or variable, the brain has every reason to keep valuing it. The body may later become hungry again, flat again, or irritable again, but by then the original reward has already been logged as useful. The next time a dip appears, the remembered solution is ready at hand. It is a feedback loop built out of convenience and short-term success. The form of the sugar matters enormously here. A sweet dessert eaten after a full meal behaves differently from a sugary drink consumed quickly on an empty stomach. Liquids are often especially efficient at delivering fast carbohydrate because they require little processing in the mouth and can be consumed almost absent-mindedly. They may not produce the same fullness as solid foods, even when they contain a substantial amount of energy. This makes them unusually good at slipping into the day as not really food, which is biologically unconvincing. The body still counts them, the brain still learns from them, and because they are easy to repeat, they can train the rise and return cycle very effectively. The same is true for sweet snacks that combine refined carbohydrates with fat and soft textures. They can be rewarding enough to feel significant, easy enough to consume quickly, and insubstantial enough that a person may still feel vaguely unsatisfied afterward. This is a powerful combination. Full satiety is not just about calories. It is influenced by volume, protein, fiber, chewing, meal structure, expectation, and whether the eating experience feels complete. A few pastries or biscuits may provide a good deal of energy, but they do not always produce the same "that was a meal" signal as foods with more protein, bulk, and slower digestion. So the body receives calories while the mind remains strangely open to more food. That gap is where recurring cravings often thrive. There is also a subtle contrast effect that can make the crash feel sharper than it otherwise would. If your state improves quickly, returning to baseline can feel like decline even when you are simply back where you started. A person who felt mentally dull, then pleasantly lifted, may interpret the fading of that lift as a new problem rather than the end of a temporary one. This matters because the brain is not just tracking absolute states, it is very sensitive to change. A fast improvement followed by a return to ordinary can feel like loss, and loss in motivational systems tends to get attention. The mind begins asking how to get back to the better feeling, and because sugar was involved last time, sugar becomes a leading candidate. This is one reason repeated sweet intake can create a day that feels chopped into little cycles of compensation. A morning pastry covers insufficient breakfast. A sugary coffee helps the mid-morning dip. Something sweet after lunch rounds off the meal and smooths the afternoon lull. Another snack appears before dinner because patience and blood sugar are both thinning. Dessert closes the evening because the brain has been taught to expect it. None of these moments necessarily feels extreme, but together they can produce a pattern in which energy stability is constantly outsourced to quick fixes. The body begins living on a series of rises and recoveries rather than on steadier, more sustaining rhythms. What makes this even harder to notice is that the return of craving does not always feel physical in a straightforward way. It can feel emotional, cognitive, or situational. You may not think I am experiencing a relative energy dip with contributions from reward prediction and incomplete satiety. You think I could really use something nice right now? That thought is not foolish. It is simply a compressed summary of several processes at once. Fatigue may be contributing, so may habit, so may the remembered pleasure of the earlier snack, so may the fact that your last meal was mostly fast carbohydrates and did not carry you very far. By the time the craving reaches consciousness, it often arrives as a mood or inclination rather than as a clearly labelled metabolic event. This is why people sometimes believe their cravings are random when they are actually highly patterned. They happen at the same times, after the same foods, in the same emotional states, or in response to the same forms of depletion. Someone who eats a sweet breakfast low in protein may find themselves ravenous by late morning and assume they are simply the type of person who needs constant snacks. Someone who leans heavily on sweetened drinks may experience repeated appetite fluctuations without realizing how much those beverages are shaping the day. Someone who uses sugar to bridge gaps between undersized meals may interpret the recurring desire for sweets as evidence of addiction in the dramatic sense, when a large part of the story may be unstable nourishment and highly trained reward associations. None of that means the physiology is simple or universal. Different bodies respond differently. Insulin sensitivity differs, meal composition differs, activity levels differ. Some people are more prone to sharp shifts in appetite after refined carbohydrates than others. Some can tolerate a sweet food with little noticeable consequence if the rest of the day is stable. Others find that one sugary snack tends to reopen the entire conversation with their appetite. The point is not that everyone crashes in exactly the same way. The point is that sugar often produces conditions under which wanting can return sooner than expected, and the brain is very good at connecting repeated dips with repeated solutions. There is another quiet mechanism at work here, and it has to do with expectations formed by sweetness itself. Sweet taste can prepare the body for incoming energy. If that energy arrives in a way the body can use quickly, the prediction and the physiological event line up neatly. If the result is only partial or fleeting satisfaction, the system may remain oddly alert. This is especially true when sweetness is consumed without much accompanying satiety. A person can satisfy the taste for a moment without fully settling the appetite. It is rather like turning down the volume on one signal while leaving the rest of the orchestra playing. The mouth received sweetness, the brain received reward, but the deeper sense of completion did not quite arrive. Under those circumstances, the appetite is very likely to come knocking again. This is one reason people so often say that sugary foods make them want more sugary foods. Part of it is reward learning, certainly. Part of it is also that sweetness can open the motivational system without necessarily closing it. A small dessert may be enough for one person and merely provocative for another. A spoonful of ice cream may calm the appetite in the context of a satisfying meal and intensify it when eaten alone at the wrong moment. Context changes everything. The same food that functions as a pleasant finish in one setting can become the first link in a long evening of grazing in another. The rise and return cycle becomes more pronounced when basic meals are inconsistent. If breakfast is skipped, lunch is delayed, protein is sparse, or the day is built around convenience foods that digest quickly, then sugar enters an already unstable system. In that situation, it is not merely adding sweetness, it is stepping into a vacuum. The brain and body are primed for fast relief, and fast relief teaches hard lessons. By contrast, when meals contain enough substance to create genuine satiety, the appeal of quick sugar often softens, not because sweet foods stop being pleasant, but because they are no longer being asked to perform emergency work for a body that has been left short on energy, structure, or both. That said, even a very well-fed body can experience the return of craving for reasons that are not strictly about calories. This is where reward and habit keep their hold. If every evening ends with something sweet, the brain may produce a craving at evening time even when dinner was plentiful. If every stressful task is followed by a treat, stress itself becomes a cue. The body is not only a metabolic system, it is also a predictive, emotional, habitual system. The curious return of craving often reflects that mixture. It is not always the body crying out for glucose. Sometimes it is the brain requesting a familiar transition, a known pleasure, a learned marker that one phase of the day has ended and another has begun. What complicates matters further is that repeated cycles of sweet relief can make ordinary states less tolerable. A mild dip in energy that might once have passed unnoticed now feels like a signal to fix. A hint of boredom becomes an opening for reward. The absence of sweetness can start to feel more noticeable because sweetness has become the usual response to discomfort. This does not mean the body's broken. It means it has become accustomed to a certain pattern of regulation. Remove the pattern and you feel the space it occupied. Many people interpret that feeling as proof that they need sugar, when often it is proof that sugar has become one of the default tools their brain reaches for. The speed of modern life encourages this. There is little patience for gradual energy management when an immediate lift is available. Real stability is built out of sleep, meal composition, routine, stress management, movement, and recovery, all of which are inconveniently slow compared with a chocolate bar. The body respects slow solutions, but the reward system is seduced by fast ones. So the rise feels helpful, the return of discomfort feels urgent, and another quick answer appears. Over time, the day can become an organized sequence of mild problems and sweet solutions, each one reinforcing the next. This is why attempts to cut sugar often feel surprisingly difficult in the first week or two, even when the person is fully committed. They are not only giving up taste, they are interrupting a timing system. The usual lifts do not arrive. The expected transitions feel empty. Baseline states, once covered by small rewards, become more visible. A mid-afternoon slump now feels like a real slump. The post-dinner lull feels unfinished without dessert. Work breaks lose some of their sparkle. These experiences are not evidence that the person was incapable of coping without sugar. They are evidence that the brain had organized parts of the day around repeated small rewards and now has to relearn how those moments feel without them. Fortunately, relearning is possible. The body can become steadier when meals are steadier. The palate can recalibrate. Reward cues can weaken. The afternoon dip can be handled by more than sugar. But before any of that becomes durable, it helps to see why the craving returns in the first place. It returns because the rise was brief, because the brain remembers short-term solutions, because habits predict pleasure, because the deeper cause of the dip may still be present, and because a modern food environment offers the same answer again and again with almost no friction. And once you notice how often those answers are recruited when a person is not merely hungry, but tired, stressed, underslept, or emotionally frayed, the next piece of the story starts to come into focus. Sugar does not only appeal to the metabolism, it appeals to the exhausted nervous system, to the evening mind that wants comfort more than principle, and to the body that has learned that certain states are easier to soften with something sweet close at hand. This is where the story gets more personal, because sugar is not only appealing when the body needs fuel in some broad metabolic sense, it is especially persuasive when the nervous system is strained. A person can go through much of the day with fairly ordinary appetite and then, by evening, find that the idea of something sweet has acquired a kind of gentle authority, not necessarily because hunger has suddenly become severe, but because tiredness, stress, decision fatigue, routine, and emotional depletion have all quietly joined forces. By that point, cookies can sound not merely tempting, but oddly sensible, as though they have stepped forward with a practical proposal for handling the day. That feeling is so common that many people barely question it. The day ends, and with it comes the thought that something should round it off. A sweet drink, a biscuit, a bowl of cereal that was technically intended for breakfast but has drifted into late-night diplomacy, some chocolate from the cupboard, dessert that was not planned but now feels morally indistinguishable from basic self-care. This pattern is widespread not because adults collectively lack discipline after sunset, but because evenings are a very particular biological and psychological environment. The body is lower on energy, the mind is lower on restraint. The reward system has had all day to accumulate cues, frustrations, and unfinished desires. Whatever structures kept food choices stable earlier on have often begun to loosen. In that state, sugar does not arrive as just another nutrient. It arrives as relief. Stress is one of the strongest forces shaping this shift. When the body experiences stress, it changes the allocation of attention and motivation. Immediate needs and immediate rewards begin to matter more. Long-term planning is still possible, of course, but it becomes more effortful. The mind narrows. It wants solutions that are quick, reliable, and familiar. Sweet foods fit that requirement unusually well. They do not need much explanation. They do not ask much of a person. They promise pleasure on contact and very often a small internal change soon after. For a stressed brain, that is a compelling offer. The biology behind this is not mysterious, though it is more layered than popular language suggests. Stress involves multiple systems, including the sympathetic nervous system and the hormonal pathways often grouped under the stress response. Cortisol is part of that picture. So are adrenaline and noradrenaline in various circumstances. Acute stress can sometimes reduce appetite in the immediate moment, particularly when the body is mobilized for action. That is why some people say they cannot eat when intensely anxious. But chronic stress is often different. When strain becomes prolonged, repetitive, and woven into daily life rather than arriving as a single sharp emergency, appetite can shift in the opposite direction. The body starts valuing comfort, energy, and reward more heavily. Highly palatable foods begin to look useful. This is not just about hunger in the narrow sense. It is about what sort of food seems capable of altering the state you are in. Stress creates wear. Even mild ongoing stress creates wear. Tight schedules, social tension, financial worry, parenting fatigue, health concerns, poor boundaries at work, small frictions repeated day after day, all of these can leave the nervous system seeking some kind of downshift. The sweet food offers a tiny ritual of certainty. It tastes familiar. It gives a quick reward. It marks a pause. In many cases, it also carries emotional associations with comfort, indulgence, or being allowed to stop trying so hard for a few minutes. The body notices all of that. There is also a reason stress and sugar so often become linked through habit. If a sweet snack reliably follows difficulty, then difficulty itself becomes a cue. The brain learns that feeling pressured may lead to a reward. The next time stress appears, the wanting may arise sooner and more forcefully. A difficult email can trigger thoughts of chocolate. A draining meeting can make a cafe stop feel inevitable. A tense conversation can turn the kitchen light into a beacon of possibility. This does not mean every stressed person develops exactly the same pattern, but it does mean the reward system is highly sensitive to pairings between unpleasant states and relieving foods. Once that pairing is learned, the craving can be activated by mood almost as readily as by hunger. Sleep loss makes the whole arrangement even easier to fall into. A tired brain is not a neutral organ making fresh, balanced decisions from a place of calm. It is a brain running on reduced resources while still being asked to do the usual work of modern life. Sleep deprivation alters appetite in several ways. It can affect hormones related to hunger and fullness. It can reduce impulse control, and it can increase the appeal of calorie-dense foods. The exact details vary by person and by study design, but the general pattern is familiar and robust enough to matter in ordinary life. When people are underslept, they often want more food, and they particularly want foods that promise quick pleasure and easy energy. This makes intuitive sense even before the lab data enters the room. If you are tired, the body and brain begin scanning for efficient compensation. They cannot simply manufacture good sleep out of nowhere, so they become more interested in what can make the current state feel more manageable. Sugary foods, especially in combination with fat and familiar textures, do a good job of seeming helpful. Sometimes they really do create a short-term lift. Sometimes they merely make the fatigue more pleasant to inhabit for 20 minutes. Either way, the lesson is learned. Tiredness plus sweetness equals a better moment than tiredness alone. The brain does not ignore lessons like that. A person who sleeps poorly for several nights in a row may therefore find their appetite changing in ways that feel strangely personal. They may think they are being weak, chaotic, or somehow less capable than usual. Often they are simply sleep deprived. This matters because tiredness changes not just what food is wanted, but how the wanting feels. Cravings under exhaustion often have a heavy, convincing quality. They do not feel like passing whims, they feel like answers. That is partly because the more reflective parts of the mind are less sharp. while the more immediate reward-seeking systems are comparatively louder. Under those conditions, a packet of biscuits can begin to present itself as a practical intervention rather than a treat. It helps to remember that self-control is not a fixed trait switched on in the morning and left unchanged by evening. It is affected by energy, mood, glucose regulation, sleep, stress, and sheer cognitive fatigue. By the end of the day, many people have already spent hours regulating emotions, solving problems, postponing impulses, responding politely to things that did not deserve politeness, and making a long series of decisions about work, family, transport, money, and time. The brain gets tired of management. This is not a metaphor. Mental effort has a cost. When the cost accumulates, simple rewards become more persuasive because the part of the mind tasked with resisting them is running short on enthusiasm. That is one reason evenings are such a reliable setting for sugar cravings. They are the point at which many people's regulatory resources are most worn down, and also the point at which access becomes easier. Work may be over. Obligations may be lighter. The home environment is close at hand. The day's emotional residue has not been fully processed. The body may also be genuinely hungry if earlier meals were rushed, inadequate, or unbalanced. Add all that together, and it becomes less mysterious why so many people who felt perfectly composed at 10 a.m. begin searching cupboards at 9 p.m. The question is not why they became irrational. The question is why we expect anyone to remain nutritionally serene after a whole day of strain. The evening has another feature that often goes unnoticed. For many people, it is the first time the nervous system has enough quiet to feel what the day has done to it. During work or busy family life, momentum can carry a person forward. Tasks keep arriving. Messages demand replies. Noise fills the space. Hunger, fatigue, disappointment, and frustration may all be present, but only partially noticed. Then the evening arrives and things slow down. With that slowing comes awareness. Suddenly you can feel the emptiness, the stress, the irritation, the sag in energy. Something sweet seems to fit naturally into that gap, not because the sugar created the gap, but because the gap has finally become visible. This is one reason emotional eating is often described in ways that make it sound more dramatic than it usually is. It is not always a person in profound distress trying to numb unbearable pain with a tub of ice cream under storm clouds. Sometimes it is much quieter. It is a person who is tired, a bit lonely, a bit overstimulated, not truly hungry for dinner but not emotionally settled either, and who finds that a sweet snack provides a small, immediate shift in texture, mood, and attention. The event may not look important from outside, but repeat it often enough, and the brain starts expecting it as part of evening regulation. Cookies sound wise in those moments because they solve several things at once, at least briefly. They give sweetness, which the reward system values. They give texture and sensory pleasure. They create a small ritual that marks transition from effort to rest. They also occupy attention. Chewing, tasting, and selecting food are not emotionally neutral acts. They give the mind something concrete to do. In the aftermath of a day full of abstractions, obligations, and unresolved thoughts, a concrete pleasure can feel remarkably convincing. You do not have to explain a biscuit to yourself in the way you have to explain your life. You simply eat it. This is also where the role of routine becomes especially clear. If every evening has come to include something sweet, then the body begins anticipating it long before the first bite. Dinner ends and the predictive machinery starts. The sofa becomes associated with dessert. The television becomes associated with dessert. The specific plate, mug, or corner of the kitchen becomes associated with dessert. Over time, those evening cues can trigger wanting almost independently of physiological hunger. A person may be full enough in nutritional terms and still feel that the day has not really closed properly without sugar. That sensation is not imaginary. It is learned. Once the pattern is established, sleep and stress can strengthen it in a rather unhelpful way. A stressful day increases desire for quick reward. Poor sleep lowers resistance and amplifies appetite for palatable foods. Evening routines provide the cue. The result is a craving that feels both emotionally justified and biologically primed. This is why people often find themselves repeating the same sweet-eating pattern for weeks or months without fully understanding why it is so stubborn. The pattern is being supported from multiple sides. It is not just taste, it is not just habit, it is not just tiredness, it is all of them working together. There is a further complication. Sweet foods consumed late in the evening can sometimes nudge sleep in directions that are less than ideal, especially when large amounts are involved, when they displace more balanced meals, or when they are paired with caffeine. Not in every person, not every time, and not always dramatically, but enough to matter. A disrupted night then feeds into the next day's fatigue, which increases the appeal of fast reward again. The loop is elegant in all the wrong ways. Tiredness invites sugar. Sugar sometimes supports less stable sleep or more erratic eating. Poor sleep invites more sugar. Each step is understandable. The full pattern can be surprisingly persistent. Mood also deserves attention here, because many people reach for sugar not when they are in obvious distress, but when they are in low-grade states that are harder to name. Restless, flat, underwhelmed, mildly resentful, vaguely lonely, bored after overstimulation, empty after social performance. These are not dramatic experiences, but they are common. The nervous system dislikes unresolved, low-level discomfort and often seeks manageable forms of relief. Sweet foods are good at presenting themselves as manageable relief. They do not ask you to call a friend, rethink your schedule, process your grief, repair your sleep, or examine your marriage. They ask only that you open the packet. From the point of view of immediate effort, that is an absurdly efficient transaction. This is why moralizing around nighttime eating tends to fail. It treats the behavior as if the person is simply choosing pleasure over virtue, when in reality they are often choosing the most available form of regulation, in a moment of depletion. That does not mean the choice is always serving them well, but it does mean the behavior becomes far easier to understand when seen as regulation rather than gluttony. A tired, stressed nervous system is not reaching for sugar because it has forgotten all nutritional principles. It is reaching because those principles are abstract and delayed, while the biscuit is concrete and immediate. Another part of the evening problem is simple availability. During the day, there may be more friction around eating. Workplaces have limits. Public settings impose some structure. There are tasks, commutes, and social expectations interrupting behavior. At home, especially at night, friction falls away. The kitchen is close. The sweet foods are familiar. No one may be watching. Portions become blurrier. The mind enters a private mode in which rewards feel easier to justify. This makes the home environment incredibly important. A house stocked with multiple sweet options gives the tired brain several easy ways to act on its craving. A house with more friction, fewer cues, or clearer meal structure often produces a very different evening. This can feel unfair, because the human ideal tends to imagine someone making pristine food choices regardless of environment. But humans are not pristine choosers. They are highly cue-responsive animals. If a person is stressed, underslept, emotionally depleted, and sitting 3 meters from a box of cookies, the outcome is not solely a referendum on character. It is a predictable interaction between state and setting. Change either one and behavior often changes. Improve sleep, reduce stress, eat more substantively earlier in the day, alter what is visible in the kitchen, and the evening craving may soften substantially. Leave all the conditions in place and merely demand more discipline, and the cookies will keep sounding wiser than they deserve. There is also the matter of reward deprivation. Many adults live days so stripped of ease, pleasure, spontaneity, or rest that food becomes one of the few rewards not requiring planning or permission. If there has been no pause, no fun, no sense of having had enough, then a sweet evening treat may become symbolically larger than its calories. It may represent compensation. It may feel like the only thing in the day that was freely chosen. The emotional weight can make it harder to reduce because now the person is not merely giving up sugar. They're giving up one of their only regular signals that life still contains some kindness. This does not mean the answer is simply to redirect all reward elsewhere, as though a person could replace chocolate with an inspirational spreadsheet. But it does mean that sugar cravings are often loudest in lives where rest, pleasure, and nourishment are too thin or badly timed. A body that is well fed, better rested, and less chronically strained tends to crave emergency comfort less intensely. Not because it has become morally superior, but because fewer alarms are ringing. The appetite system is calmer when the broader organism is calmer, and yet, even when the evening craving makes perfect sense, many people still feel ashamed of it, because it seems childish, as if adulthood ought to involve finishing the day with herbal tea and a dignified detachment from biscuits. But the sweet-seeking evening brain is not childish. It is ancient, tired, and highly responsive to repeated comfort. It is doing what nervous systems do when they are worn down and offered an easy reward. The problem is not immaturity. The problem is that modern life wears people out in ways that make easy rewards disproportionately attractive, and modern food environments are very good at providing them. Once you start seeing the pattern this way, the craving becomes less of a mysterious personal failure and more of a clue. It tells you something about the day that came before it. Maybe meals were too small, maybe stress never truly let up, maybe sleep has been poor for a week, maybe the evening routine itself has become fused with sugar. Maybe there are not enough other forms of reward. In many cases, it is several of these at once. The cookies sound wise because the brain has learned that, under certain conditions, they offer one of the quickest ways to soften what the body's carrying. That still leaves a deeper question, though, because cravings are not shaped only by reward and routine. They're also influenced by a whole cast of internal signals that rise and fall all day long. Hormones that help regulate hunger and satiety, bodily rhythms that alter appetite, and habits so familiar they begin to feel like biology itself. To really understand why sugar can seem to arrive on schedule, we have to look at the quieter machinery underneath the mood, the routines and the long evenings when dessert starts sounding less like a choice and more like part of the operating system. Beneath all the obvious reasons people reach for sugar, there is a quieter layer of regulation that tends to go unnoticed until it starts behaving inconveniently. Appetite does not simply appear because you saw a biscuit or because you had a stressful day. It is being shaped constantly by internal signals, by the timing of meals, by the body's clock, by the way certain foods affect fullness, and by habits repeated so often that they begin to feel innate. This is why cravings can seem so strangely scheduled. A person may swear they always want something sweet at 3 p.m. or after dinner or late at night, as though their body has drawn up a small but determined appointment. In one sense, it has. Not because appetite runs like a train timetable, but because the body is a system of rhythms and expectations, and it likes to learn what usually happens next. A large part of that system involves hormones, though hormones are often spoken about as if they are commanding officers barking orders. In reality, they are more like signals moving through a crowded room, influencing behaviour, adjusting priorities, changing how loudly certain needs are felt. Hunger and fullness are regulated by many interacting cues rather than by a single switch. The stomach, intestines, pancreas, fat tissue, brain, and nervous system all participate. Some signals rise before meals, some increase after eating, some reflect a longer-term energy status, and some are altered by sleep, stress, and routine. The result is not perfect control, it is a dynamic negotiation. One of the more familiar names in this conversation is ghrelin, often described as a hunger hormone. That description is broadly useful, though a little too tidy. Ghrelin tends to rise before meals and can stimulate appetite, helping the body prepare for eating. It is one of the ways the system says food would be a good idea now, but ghrelin does not work alone, and it does not create hunger out of nothing. It interacts with expectation, habit, and actual energy needs. This is why someone who usually eats lunch at noon may begin feeling hungry around noon even on a day when breakfast was unusually large. The body has learned the timing. Ghrelin and related processes help prepare for what is expected. If the meal is delayed, that expectation can make appetite feel sharper than the metabolic situation alone might predict. This matters for sugar cravings because predictable meal timing can create predictable openings for reward. If the body is accustomed to a sweet snack at a certain hour, the hormonal preparation for eating may become entangled with the learned expectation of sweetness. A mid-afternoon dip is no longer just a mid-afternoon dip. It is the time when something sweet usually appears. The stomach, the brain, and the habit system begin leaning in the same direction. That is why a craving can feel bodily even when it is partly learned. The body and the learned routine are not separate worlds. They reinforce one another until the pattern feels natural. On the opposite side of hunger are the signals associated with satiety, the sense that you have eaten enough. Several hormones and neural pathways are involved here as well, including peptide YY, GLP-1, cholecystokinin, insulin, and signals related to stomach stretch and nutrient sensing. Different foods influence these signals differently. Protein generally tends to be quite helpful for satiety. Fiber and food volume also matter. Fat can slow digestion and increase satisfaction in some contexts, though highly processed fat-rich foods do not always behave in the helpful way one might hope. Sweet foods that are refined and easy to consume can produce a peculiar mismatch. Calories arrive, reward arrives, but fullness is not always as durable or complete as the person expected. This helps explain why some sugary foods feel as though they don't count in the body until much later, when hunger returns and confusion follows. A pastry and a sweet coffee may deliver substantial energy, but depending on the rest of the day, they may not create the same settled satiety as a more balanced meal containing protein, fiber, and bulk. The person has eaten, but the appetite system has not necessarily been convinced that the problem is solved for long. This can create a very modern form of nutritional ambiguity in which people are simultaneously overfed in energy and underfed in terms of lasting fullness. That ambiguity is excellent soil for recurring sugar cravings. There is also insulin, which gets blamed for nearly everything in some corners of the internet and treated as an irrelevant detail in others. In reality, insulin is essential and normal. It helps regulate blood glucose and allows the body to manage incoming carbohydrate. It also has effects in the brain and contributes to the broader web of appetite regulation. The problem is not that insulin exists or that it rises after carbohydrate intake. The difficulty comes when eating patterns become highly skewed toward foods that repeatedly produce fast rises, shallow satiety, and unstable cycles of hunger and reward. Under those conditions, the hormonal conversation can become noisy. Appetite becomes less predictable, or rather predictably erratic. Then there is leptin, a hormone produced largely by fat tissue that helps signal longer-term energy availability. In simple terms, leptin is part of the body's way of informing the brain about stored energy. When functioning well, it contributes to the sense that resources are available and that relentless food seeking is unnecessary. But the appetite system is not a simple dashboard where one hormone says enough and the matter is settled. In some people, especially when body fat is higher and metabolic regulation is more complicated, the brain may not respond to leptin signals as effectively as one might hope. In others, dieting, weight loss, or chronic underfeeding can reduce leptin and increase appetite pressure. This is one reason sugar cravings can become louder when people try to eat too little for too long. The body does not interpret restriction as a noble moral project. It interprets it as a change in energy availability, and its response is often to make food more interesting. This is where habits enter with remarkable force. Hormones set the stage, but habits write much of the script. If you repeatedly eat something sweet after lunch, the body learns that lunch is followed by sweetness. If evenings end with dessert, then satiety from dinner may not be enough to quiet the appetite because the routine includes a second act. If work breaks mean a sugary drink and a snack, then the break itself becomes appetitive territory. Over time, these patterns blur the line between physiological need and learned expectation. A person feels they need something sweet, and in one sense that feeling is real. But what they are often experiencing is the body's extraordinary ability to internalize routine until routine begins to feel like biology. That internalization is one of the hidden rhythms of appetite. People tend to imagine biological drives as raw and natural and habits as something artificial laid over the top. In reality, repeated habits become embedded in biological timing. The body starts preparing for what usually happens. Digestive processes shift. Anticipatory signals rise. Attention sharpens around expected food opportunities. This is efficient when the routine is useful. It becomes awkward when the routine is built around sweets that satisfy briefly and then reopen the conversation an hour later. Still, the body does not know that from the perspective of your long-term goals. It knows only that a certain event has reliably followed another event many times before. Circadian rhythms add another layer. Humans are not metabolically identical at every hour of the day. Hormones shift across the 24-hour cycle. Body temperature changes, alertness changes, insulin sensitivity changes. Appetite itself can shift, not only because of what you have eaten, but because of what time it is. Many people find that cravings are weaker in the early morning and stronger later in the day. Part of this is psychological and situational, but part of it also reflects the body's rhythms. By evening you may be more tired, more stress-worn and more exposed to routine cues, but you're also operating in a different internal state than you were at breakfast. Interestingly, some people are not especially hungry when they first wake up, even if they become very hungry later. That can encourage a pattern of light mornings and increasingly snack-driven afternoons. If breakfast is minimal or absent, lunch may be rushed, and by late afternoon the appetite system is trying to catch up in a body that is already low on patience. Sweet foods then gain an advantage because they promise immediate help. The craving looks like an isolated weakness in the late day, but often it was prepared by the rhythm of the whole day. Appetite is rarely just about the current moment. It is cumulative. The body clock also interacts with reward. Some evidence suggests that highly palatable foods may feel especially tempting at certain times, particularly later in the day when restraint is down and the value of immediate reward is up. Even without formal data, ordinary life makes this plausible. Very few people describe being overwhelmed by the need for cake at 7:10 in the morning while tying their shoes. By 9:30 in the evening, however, the same cake can seem to possess deep psychological relevance. That shift is not because sugar changes its nature after dark. It is because the person has changed. The day has altered their internal state, and the body's rhythms have altered the context in which food is evaluated. Meal composition affects these rhythms too. A breakfast or lunch built largely from fast-digesting carbohydrates may produce a different appetite pattern from one containing more protein, fiber, and substantial volume. The body's not counting only calories, it is reading texture, digestion speed, nutrient content, and the presence or absence of signals that tell it a proper meal has taken place. This is why some people can eat what looks, on paper, like a perfectly adequate amount of food and still feel haunted by snacks. The meals may not be structured in a way that produces durable satiety. A bowl of sweet cereal and milk can be enjoyable, quick, and familiar, but it may not hold someone the way eggs, yogurt, oats, fruit, and nuts might. Two lunches can contain similar energy while creating very different afternoons. Hidden rhythms also arise from association with activity. The body learns to expect food in relation to commuting, finishing work, sitting down to watch television, putting children to bed, or even walking through the front door. These are not hormonal triggers in the narrow sense, but they become entwined with physiology because they happen repeatedly in real bodies, on real schedules. A commuter who always buys a sweet coffee at the station may begin craving one before reaching the platform. A parent who snacks while clearing the kitchen may feel peckish every time dishes begin. The event becomes part of the appetite map. Stress can bend all of these rhythms out of shape. Under chronic pressure, meal timing often becomes less orderly, sleep gets worse, food choices become more reactive, and the body starts relying more on fast rewards. Hormonal regulation becomes harder to interpret because stress itself can mimic or amplify hunger in strange ways. Some people lose appetite under stress and then rebound later. Some snack continuously without ever feeling properly full. Some find that they are not physically hungry but cannot stop thinking about sweet foods. In those moments, the body's running multiple programs at once: energy management, emotional regulation, habit prediction, and reward seeking. No single hormone explains that. It is the interaction that matters. The same is true of dieting, which often scrambles appetite rhythms in both obvious and subtle ways. When people try to be good all day by under-eating, skipping meals, or choosing foods that are low in energy but also not very satisfying, the body often responds by increasing food preoccupation and strengthening the appeal of quick rewards later. Evening sugar cravings can therefore be partly the consequence of daytime over-control. The person experiences the later craving as evidence that they ruined everything, when in reality the day may have been steering them there from the start. Appetite systems do not admire rigid restraint. They respond to conditions. If the condition suggests scarcity or imbalance, food becomes more salient. Then there is sensory-specific expectation, a quieter phenomenon, but an important one. Sometimes the body does not merely want more food in general, it wants a certain type of finish. After a savoury meal, many people report wanting something sweet. This is not always because they are hungry. It may reflect learned contrast, reward completion, or simple habit. If a sweet taste has repeatedly marked the end of eating, then the absence of that sweetness can make the meal feel unfinished. Again, the body learns sequence. First the savoury course, then the sweet one, then the sense of closure. Remove the second step and closure may not arrive as expected. A person can therefore feel dissatisfied after an adequate meal, not because the meal failed nutritionally, but because the ritual was incomplete. The modern food environment exploits this brilliantly by making sweet endings cheap, easy, and endlessly variable. A small dessert, a biscuit with tea, a sweetened yogurt, a square of chocolate, a spoonful of something from the freezer, each becomes a tiny punctuation mark in the day. The body starts expecting punctuation. Appetite gains rhythm not just from hunger and fullness, but from the choreography of repeated rewards. This is why sugar cravings can be remarkably specific. Not hungry, perhaps, but wanting precisely the thing that usually comes now. What complicates matters still further is that these rhythms can survive even when the original conditions change. A person who used to need a sweet snack to survive a demanding afternoon at work may keep craving it long after their schedule becomes easier. Someone who learned to eat dessert after childhood dinners may keep feeling the pull decades later in a totally different life. Habits outlast circumstances because the brain conserves useful predictions. It does not automatically update just because you have become an adult with opinions about blood glucose. It updates through repeated new experience, and repeated new experience takes time. This is one reason consistency matters more than intensity when people try to change their relationship with sugar. A dramatic decision made once has less influence on appetite rhythms than a quieter pattern repeated many times. If breakfast becomes more substantial every day, the late morning craving may gradually weaken. If dessert is replaced by another closing ritual often enough, the post-dinner expectation may soften. If sleep improves, some hunger signals may calm. If stress reduces, the drive for quick reward may ease. None of this happens overnight, because the body is not a switchboard. It is a living archive of repeated timings, signals, and rewards. And yet, for all this internal complexity, appetite is not determined only by hormones and habits inside the body. It is also shaped by something else that lives even closer to the digestive tract than most people realize. The gut is not just a passive tube handling the consequences of your decisions. It is metabolically active, chemically communicative, and home to a dense ecosystem of microbes that interact with digestion, signaling, and perhaps even aspects of what and when you feel like eating. Once that enters the picture, the story of sugar cravings becomes even more interesting because now the appetite is not only a conversation between your brain and your hormones, it may also be influenced by a whole community living inside you and feeding, in part, on the patterns you repeat often enough to become a way of life. That is where the gut enters the story more directly, because by the time a craving reaches consciousness, the brain is not working alone. It is receiving signals from a digestive system that is far more talkative than most people realize. The gut is not just where food goes after you have made your decision, it is part of the machinery that helps shape the decision in the first place. It sends updates about fullness, nutrient content, stretch, inflammation, timing, and the general state of the digestive tract. It also houses a vast community of microbes, mostly bacteria, that live along the intestines and interact with what you eat often enough that they become, in a very practical sense, part of your metabolic environment. None of this means your gut bacteria are secretly ordering you to eat cake with the confidence of tiny dictators. The truth is less dramatic and more interesting. The gut influences hunger quietly, through chemistry, timing, digestion, and repeated exposure. And because it does this day after day, the influence can become significant without ever feeling theatrical. For a long time, people tended to think of digestion as something fairly mechanical. Food goes in, acid and enzymes do their work, nutrients are absorbed, waste continues onward, and the whole business proceeds with admirable plumbing. The more researchers looked, though, the clearer it became that the digestive tract is also a signalling organ. It communicates with the brain through hormones, immune pathways, and nerves, particularly the vagus nerve, which carries a great deal of information between the gut and the central nervous system. This does not mean the gut is a second brain in the popular magazine sense where your intestines are quietly developing opinions about your career. But it does mean that what happens in the gut can influence mood, appetite, and motivation in ways that are biologically real, even if they do not always translate into neat, conscious messages. When food arrives in the gut, the body does more than count calories. It monitors composition. Is there fat, protein, fiber, a large volume, rapidly absorbed carbohydrate? The intestines release hormones that help regulate appetite, digestion, and blood sugar. Some slow gastric emptying. Some promote satiety. Some help the brain register that eating has taken place and that more food may not be urgently needed. This system works better with some foods than with others. Whole foods and mixed meals often provide a richer and more durable stream of signals than highly refined sweet foods, which can be quick to consume, quick to absorb, and comparatively thin in the kinds of characteristics that help produce lasting fullness. In other words, some foods talk to the gut in a way that helps settle the appetite. Others make a strong first impression and then leave rather quickly. This matters because the gut does not merely respond to one meal in isolation. It also adapts to patterns. If most of the diet is built around foods that digest quickly and provide weak satiety signals, the body can end up in a state where hunger returns frequently and cravings feel harder to distinguish from genuine energy need. That is not solely a microbial story, but the microbes become part of it because they are shaped by what passes through. The gut microbiome depends heavily on diet. Feed it one pattern repeatedly, and one microbial balance tends to emerge. Feed it another pattern, and a different balance may take hold. This shift does not happen in an afternoon, and it does not reduce appetite to bacterial preference, but over time it can influence how the gut behaves and what signals it sends. The microbes themselves live mostly in the large intestine and interact with food components that escape digestion earlier on, especially certain fibres and resistant starches. When they ferment these materials, they produce metabolites, including short-chain fatty acids such as acetate, propionate, and butyrate. These compounds do several useful things. They can help support the health of the gut lining, influence inflammation, and interact with appetite-regulating pathways. They are part of the reason fibre-rich diets often seem to calm appetite more effectively than diets built around refined, low-fibre foods. It is not only that fibre adds volume or slows digestion in a mechanical sense, it also gives the gut microbe something to work with, and the products of that work can become part of the broader conversation between gut and brain. This is one reason the modern diet can be so awkward from the point of view of appetite regulation. Many sugary, ultra-processed foods are extremely good at delivering reward and extremely poor at feeding the parts of the system that help create durable fullness and microbial stability. They often move quickly, contain relatively little fibre, and provide a nutritional experience that is intense in the mouth, but less impressive in the colon, where many microbes do their best work. A person can therefore be consuming plenty of energy, while giving the gut ecosystem a rather repetitive and limited menu. Over time, that may help create digestive and metabolic conditions that are less steady than they could be. It is important, though, not to turn the microbiome into a convenient little fairy tale where the good bacteria want salad and the bad bacteria demand sweets. Real biology is not that tidy. The microbiome is incredibly complex, highly individual, and still not fully understood. Researchers have found many associations between gut microbial patterns and obesity, diabetes, inflammation, and eating behaviour. But association is not the same as a clean line of causation. People differ in genetics, environment, medications, sleep, stress, exercise, and long-term diet, all of which influence both the microbiome and appetite. So when we talk about microbes and sugar cravings, the honest version is this: the gut ecosystem likely contributes to appetite regulation and metabolic stability, and dietary patterns that support a healthier, more diverse microbiome may help reduce the conditions under which cravings thrive. What we should not say is that a particular bacterium is sitting there personally composing your shopping list. Still, even with that caution, the gut's influence can be surprisingly concrete. Consider satiety after different meals. A breakfast of sweetened cereal and juice may be enjoyable and quick, but many people are hungry again sooner than they would be after a breakfast containing protein, fibre, and a more slowly digested carbohydrate source. Part of that difference involves hormones and blood sugar, certainly, but part also involves what the downstream digestive tract is receiving. A more varied, less refined meal tends to produce a different digestive experience, and over time those repeated experiences help train both appetite rhythms and microbial balance. The person may not notice the gut directly, they simply notice that some days feel much easier to manage than others. There is also the gut barrier to consider. The lining of the intestines is not a passive wall, it is an active interface between the outside world, in the form of food and microbes, and the inside world of the immune system and bloodstream. A healthy gut barrier helps regulate what crosses and what does not. Some dietary patterns, especially when paired with chronic stress, low fibre intake, alcohol excess, poor sleep or inflammation, may contribute to a gut environment that is less resilient. Researchers are still working through the details here, but it is reasonable to say that digestive health, immune signalling and appetite do not live in separate boxes. A body dealing with low-grade inflammation or chronic digestive irritation may not regulate hunger and reward as gracefully as one that is better supported. That is part of the quiet politics of hunger. Many influences are competing without announcing themselves. The tongue votes for sweetness because it recognizes reward. The brain votes for relief because the day has been tiring. Hormones vote based on meal timing, energy state, and sleep. The gut votes based on what has been digested, how much fibre has arrived, how quickly the stomach emptied, what metabolites the microbes produced, and whether the system feels settled or agitated. None of these votes is final. Appetite is the result of negotiation. The reason sugar cravings can feel so persuasive is that sugar tends to gather support from several parties at once. It tastes good, acts quickly, is easy to access, and often appears in a body whose slower regulatory systems have not been well supported. Antibiotics offer an interesting side note here, because they can significantly disrupt the gut microbiome, at least temporarily. Many people notice digestive changes, altered bowel habits, or shifts in appetite after a course of antibiotics. That does not prove a simple one-to-one relationship between microbes and sugar craving, but it does remind us that appetite is influenced by the state of the digestive ecosystem. The same can be true after gastrointestinal illness, major dietary change, travel, or periods of high stress. People often say they just feel off in their eating after such events. Sometimes what feels off is precisely that the gut-brain conversation has been disturbed. Fermented foods and fibre-rich plant foods often come up in discussions like this, and for good reason, though, again, the subject is usually presented too simply. Yogurt, kefir, kimchi, sauerkraut, legumes, oats, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and whole grains can all contribute in different ways to a more supportive gut environment. Fermented foods may help introduce or support beneficial microbes, while fibre-rich foods provide the substrates many resident microbes use to produce helpful metabolites. The result is not a miraculous immunity to dessert. What it can do, over time, is help the digestive system produce steadier satiety, calmer blood sugar responses, and a less chaotic background state in which cravings are less likely to dominate every available gap in the day. This is why people sometimes report that after a few weeks of eating more consistently and more fibre-rich foods, they do not feel obsessed with sweets in the same way, even though they still enjoy them. The reward system has not disappeared. What has changed is the broader terrain around it. Meals are more settling. Hunger is less erratic. The microbiome may be better fed. The digestive tract may be sending clearer fullness signals. The body feels less like it is staggering from one quick fix to the next. In that state, a sweet food can return to being one option among many, rather than the obvious answer to every dip in energy, mood, or patience. The reverse can happen too. Diets very low in fibre and high in ultra-processed foods can create days that are strangely empty in terms of true digestive satisfaction. Plenty of taste, plenty of energy, plenty of packaging, but not much that keeps the gut busy in a useful way for long. The microbes receive a narrower set of inputs. The colon has less fermentable material. Satiety may be patchy. Bowel habits may become less regular. None of this automatically creates sugar cravings, but it can produce a bodily background in which quick rewarding foods keep sounding more helpful than they really are. A person may interpret this as a personality trait when it's partly a feature of digestive ecology. Another quiet way the gut influences hunger is through speed. How quickly food leaves the stomach affects how quickly hunger can return and how meals are experienced. Protein, fibre, and some fats tend to slow gastric emptying more than sugary drinks or refined snacks. That slower movement is often useful. It stretches out the digestive conversation. The body has more time to register what has been eaten. A sweet drink, by contrast, can be over and absorbed before the satiety systems have fully assembled their paperwork. If too many daily calories arrive in fast, refined forms, the gut is constantly trying to keep up with short, intense episodes rather than guiding the body through longer, more informative meals. There is also the issue of variety, which the gut microbiome tends to appreciate more than many modern diets provide. A more varied intake of plant foods appears to be associated with greater microbial diversity, which is generally considered a marker of resilience, though not the only one. A diet dominated by a small number of processed foods, many of them sweetened, can be very repetitive from a microbial standpoint even if it feels exciting in the mouth. Different coloured wrappers do not necessarily represent deep ecological diversity in the colon. The microbes are less impressed by brand innovation than humans are. Give them 10 versions of flavoured sweetened yogurt, and they do not congratulate you on your adventurous palate. This microbial perspective also sheds light on why abrupt dietary extremes can feel unpleasant. If someone suddenly slashes sugar and ultra-processed foods while dramatically increasing fibre overnight, the gut may protest for a while. Bloating, gas and discomfort can appear, not because the new foods are wrong, but because the system has to adapt. The microbes change in response to new substrates, fermentation patterns shift, and the intestines need time to adjust. This is another reason sustainable change usually works better than dramatic declarations. The gut, like the brain, prefers repeated realities over heroic speeches. The link between microbes and mood has attracted a great deal of attention, and although some of that attention has run ahead of the evidence, the general idea that gut state can influence mental state is not far-fetched. Through immune pathways, nerve signaling, and metabolic products, the gut may affect how people feel in ways that could indirectly shape appetite. A person who is more anxious, more inflamed, or more physically uncomfortable may be more prone to seek quick reward. Again, caution is important. We should not promise that fixing the microbiome will solve emotional eating and restore inner peace by Thursday. But it is fair to say that a calmer, healthier gut is often part of a calmer, healthier appetite landscape. One of the trickiest things about all this is that the gut's influence is mostly silent. You do not usually feel your microbes voting. You feel the result as inclination, a restlessness around food, a more stable afternoon, a lower urge to snack, a stronger pull towards sweets after several days of erratic meals. Because the gut does its work below awareness, people tend to ignore it until something goes wrong. Yet its quiet signals are shaping daily behaviour all the time. The politics are quiet precisely because nobody gives a speech. The decisions are made through chemistry and repetition. This also helps explain why two people can eat the same dessert and have very different experiences afterward. One feels satisfied and moves on. Another finds that the dessert has opened the door to more snacking. Part of that difference may be psychological, part hormonal, part habitual, and part digestive. The meal that came before matters. Sleep matters. Stress matters. The gut state matters. The microbiome may matter. Appetite is not a single lever being pulled. It is a whole panel of dials, and sugar often affects several at once. That is why dietary advice built solely around restraint so often feels thin. It says no without asking what the body is negotiating with. A person who is underslept, highly stressed, eating low-fibre meals, rushing through the day on sweetened drinks and convenient snacks, and then blaming themselves for wanting chocolate in the evening, is not facing a simple problem of character. They are facing a problem of ecology as much as psychology. The internal environment has been trained toward instability. The gut has not been given much help. The appetite system is being asked to stay calm in conditions that repeatedly provoke it. Feed the gut differently for long enough though, and the conversation can change. Meals with more protein, more fibre, more legumes, more intact grains, more vegetables, more fruit, more nuts, more seeds, more fermented foods where appropriate. These can gradually create a more stable digestive background. Hunger may become less frantic. Fullness may last longer. Bowel habits may improve. Energy may stop arriving in such dramatic little episodes. Sugar does not become unappealing in some absolute sense, but it often loses some of its authority. It is easier to say yes or no from a body that is less biochemically needy. There is an interesting twist here though, because modern food technology has not only learned how to deliver sugar, it has also learned how to deliver sweetness without sugar, or at least with far less of it, and that raises a different kind of question. What happens when the mouth tastes sweetness? The brain hears the familiar signal, and the usual caloric follow-up is missing or changed. Does the system calmly accept the substitution, Does it become satisfied? Does it become confused? The answer, as usual, depends on context, learning, and the very same appetite machinery we've been tracing all along. This is where many people make what seems like a very sensible deal. If sugar is the problem, then sweetness without sugar ought to solve it. Keep the taste, lose the calories, avoid the blood sugar rise, carry on with life. On paper, it has a tidy elegance, and in some situations it really can help. The US Food and Drug Administration says common high-intensity sweeteners, such as aspartame, sucralose, saccharin, steviol glycosides and monk fruit extracts, are used because they are far sweeter than table sugar. So much smaller amounts are needed, and many contribute few or no calories while generally not raising blood glucose the way sugar does. That basic substitution is real. A diet drink is not metabolically identical to a sugary one. A sweetener packet is not the same thing as spooning sugar into tea. So the trouble is not that artificial sweetness does nothing. The trouble is that it does not always do everything people hope it will do. One of the first reasons is simply that sweetness is not only about calories. The tongue recognizes sweet taste quickly, and the brain treats that taste as meaningful, whether it comes from sugar or from a non-sugar sweetener. In other words, the sensory event still happens. The familiar signal still arrives. The reward system still hears sweetness and begins making predictions about what sort of experience is underway. This matters because many people are not trying to escape calories alone. They are trying to quiet the whole learned relationship with sweetness, the anticipation, the comfort, the routine, the little sense that a meal or a break or an evening has not quite finished until something sweet appears. A sugar-free soda may remove one part of that loop while leaving the rest intact. The affair continues because the language of sweetness is still being spoken fluently, even when the calories have left the room. There is also the awkward fact that the body and brain often prefer matching signals. Sugar does two things at once. It tastes sweet, and it delivers energy. Many non-sugar sweeteners preserve the first half of that bargain while weakening or removing the second. For some people, that is perfectly workable. For others, it seems to leave the appetite slightly unsatisfied, as though the mouth announced one thing and the rest of the body received a different follow-up. A recent study published in 2025 found that, compared with sucrose and water, sucralose altered hypothalamic and connectivity responses in ways suggesting an effect on appetite regulation, and hunger increased after sucralose compared with sucrose in that experiment. That does not mean every diet drink automatically makes every person hungrier. It does mean the mismatch between sweet taste and expected metabolic payoff may matter more than older, simpler theories assumed. At the same time, it would be too simple and frankly unfair to say that artificial sweeteners are useless, or that they always backfire. Some randomized trials and meta-analyses point in the other direction. A 52-week randomized trial comparing non-nutritive sweetened beverages with water during a behavioral weight management program found slightly greater weight loss in the sweetened beverage group, although the authors noted the difference was not clinically significant. A 2024 grade-assessed systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials also concluded that non-nutritive sweeteners may reduce total energy and carbohydrate intake compared with sugar. So, in a direct substitution, especially when someone is replacing sugar-sweetened drinks or foods with lower calorie versions rather than adding them on top, these products can reduce intake. That part of the story is real too. The reason artificial sweetness does not always end the affair, then, is not that the substitution is fake. It is that the substitution is partial. You may remove sugar but keep the habit. You may cut calories in one place but compensate somewhere else later. You may preserve your preference for intense sweetness even as you reduce sugar itself. The World Health Organization's 2023 guideline reflects exactly this tension. Chu says its recommendation against using non-sugar sweeteners for weight control is not about the toxicological safety of individual sweeteners. It is about long-term effectiveness. Lembo concluded that the available evidence did not show long-term benefit for reducing body fat, and noted potential undesirable associations in long-term observational data, while also emphasizing that those associations may be confounded and that the recommendation is conditional. That is a very different claim from saying the products are poisonous. It is closer to saying they are not a reliable long-term answer to the larger problem of a very sweet diet. That phrase matters more than it may seem, a very sweet diet. Because sometimes what needs changing is not only the amount of sugar, but the degree to which the palate and reward system expect frequent sweetness of any kind. If every coffee is sweet, every yogurt is sweet, every drink is sweet, every dessert is replaced with a sugar-free version rather than occasionally being absent altogether, then the body may never really get the chance to lower the volume of its sweet expectation. One review from 2022 noted that most studies did not show increased sweetness preference or energy intake from non-nutritive sweeteners, which is important and somewhat reassuring. But the same review also emphasized that the impact on appetite control and long-term weight management remains unclear. In real life, that uncertainty is easy to understand. A person may not become more sweetness-loving in a measurable laboratory way, and yet still maintain a day built around sweet taste as a regular feature, cue, and comfort. This is why a sugar-free biscuit can sometimes feel oddly similar to an ordinary biscuit in the mind, even when the nutritional label differs. The taste still marks reward, the timing still matters, the context still matters. After lunch still means something sweet, the afternoon break still means something sweet, the drive home still means something sweet, the sofa still means something sweet. The brain is not an accountant working only from calorie totals, it is a pattern learner. If the pattern is preserved, the motivational pull may be preserved too. A person can therefore switch products without fully changing the relationship. They may even feel confused by this. I replace the sugary drinks. I buy the light yogurt. I chose the no-sugar version. Why do I still want dessert every night? Often because the cue response structure has barely changed. Sweetness still arrives at all the old appointments. There is another reason the affair can continue, and it is almost disappointingly ordinary. People are very good at compensation, often without noticing. If a diet drink saves calories, that can make a pastry feel more justified. If a sugar-free dessert feels virtuous, portion size may drift. If a person believes they have been especially good all day because they avoided sugar, they may become more vulnerable to eating for reward later, especially under stress or fatigue. This is not because artificial sweeteners cause moral chaos. It is because humans rarely respond to food as isolated chemistry. We respond through stories, permissions, trade-offs, and habits. Controlled trials can show what happens when one variable is changed carefully. Real life adds exhaustion, self-negotiation, late evenings, and the astonishing human ability to turn a reduced-calorie beverage into an argument for cake. WHO's caution about long-term weight control makes more sense once you remember how complicated actual eating behaviour is outside a study design. The kind of product matters too. Replacing sugar in a beverage may not work the same way as replacing sugar in a dessert, a protein bar, a flavoured yogurt, or a heavily processed snack. Some products use non-sugar sweeteners mainly to reduce sugar while keeping taste. Others use them inside foods that are still highly engineered, easy to overconsume, and tightly linked to reward cues. A no-sugar energy drink is not the same behavioural object as a sugar-free jelly, and neither is the same as a packet of sweetener in plain yogurt. This is why broad arguments about artificial sweeteners often become silly. The question is not whether sweeteners are good or bad in the abstract. The question is what they are replacing, in whom, how often, under what conditions, and whether the broader diet is becoming less dominated by sweet, ultra-palatable food or merely shifting brands. There is also the small matter of satisfaction. Sugar does more than sweeten. In many foods it adds bulk, texture, mouthfeel, browning, viscosity, and that rounded sense that the product is complete. Remove it, and manufacturers often have to compensate in other ways, which is why sugar-free products can taste a little thin, a little metallic, or strangely emphatic in their sweetness. Sometimes this leads people to keep chasing satisfaction. They have the diet version. It is close but not quite there, and later they want something else. Not always sugar itself, but something more substantial, more real, more finishing. The mouth has been engaged, but the sense of completion is weak. From the point of view of appetite, that is not trivial. A food that satisfies poorly can leave the reward system looking for a second opinion. Safety and usefulness also need to be separated cleanly, because they are not the same question. The FDA's role is largely about whether approved sweeteners can be used safely under specified conditions, and the agency notes that common approved sweeteners or GRAS high-intensity sweeteners can be used in foods and beverages sold as sugar-free or diet products. WHO's recommendation, by contrast, says it is not updating toxicological safety limits and is instead addressing whether non-sugar sweeteners help reduce unhealthy weight gain and diet-related disease over the long term. Those are different conversations. A substance can be considered safe within established intake limits, and still not solve the behavioural problem it was recruited to solve. This is one of the reasons public discussion becomes muddled. People hear criticism of sweeteners and assume it means immediate danger, when often the more precise point is simpler. These products are not guaranteed to reduce cravings, improve diet quality, or end a long attachment to sweetness. And then there is the psychological side, which may be the most quietly important of all. Many people do not actually want a chemically exact reduction in sugar exposure. What they want is to feel less preoccupied by sweet food. They want fewer cravings, less food noise, less bargaining with themselves at night, less sense that the day is punctuated by sweet rewards. Non-sugar sweeteners can be helpful for some of that, but they can also preserve the very structure of thought someone is trying to escape. You stop drinking cola but still need sweetness in a bottle. You stop buying sugary yogurt but still need dessert in a tub. You stop putting sugar in coffee but still need coffee to taste sweet before it feels emotionally cooperative. Again, nothing sinister has happened. The palate and the reward system have simply been maintained rather than retrained. The affair changes costume, but the relationship remains recognizable. This is why the most sensible view is usually the least dramatic one. Artificial sweetness can be a useful tool, especially when it directly replaces a significant source of sugar and helps lower energy intake without causing that person to compensate elsewhere. It may be particularly useful in transitions, in beverages, or in situations where the alternative would plainly be more sugar. But it is not a magical escape hatch from a sweet-conditioned appetite. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes it merely rearranges the habit. Sometimes it reduces calories while keeping cravings alive. Sometimes, at least with certain sweeteners and in certain settings, it may even leave the appetite more alert than sugar itself. The body is not fooled in one simple universal way, nor is it fully satisfied in one simple universal way. It is learning from context, from mismatch, from routine, and from what sweetness continues to mean in daily life. So when artificial sweetness does not quite settle the matter, that is not because you failed to choose the correct loophole. It is because the deeper issue was never only sugar crystals versus sweetener packets. It was reward, rhythm, expectation, comfort, habit, and the nervous system's long romance with anything that promises easy pleasure. Swap one ingredient and you may improve one part of the picture. But if sweetness is still handling your stress breaks, finishing your meals, softening your evenings, and standing in for other forms of rest or nourishment, then the pull may remain surprisingly familiar. Which means the next step is not really about winning a technical argument between sugar and sweeteners. It is about figuring out how to loosen the whole pattern without turning food into a moral battlefield, and that is where making peace with sugar becomes much more useful than trying to defeat it. By the time most people decide they want to fix their sugar problem, they are already exhausted by the way they have been thinking about it. They have tried rules, bans, resets, cheat days, cleaner Mondays, stricter Tuesdays, and private negotiations in the kitchen that sound like peace talks between hostile governments. They tell themselves they will be disciplined, and then they are tired, or stressed, or hungry, or simply human, and the old pattern returns. After that comes the familiar disappointment, which usually carries a hidden assumption. If I were stronger, this would be easy. But most of the time the real issue is not strength, it is strategy. Fighting yourself is often a poor long-term plan because the body does not learn calm from war. It learns calm from predictability, from enough food at the right times, from reduced chaos, from fewer cues, from better sleep, and from habits repeated gently enough that they can actually survive real life. NIDDK's guidance on behaviour change makes a very similar point in plainer public health language. New habits are a process, small changes can become routine, and setbacks are normal rather than proof of failure. So making peace with sugar does not mean pretending sugar is irrelevant, nor does it mean deciding that every craving should be obeyed because self-compassion is in fashion. It means stepping out of the old argument between total surrender and total control. In practice, that usually starts with one quiet but important change in tone. Instead of asking, "How do I stop wanting this?" it is more useful to ask, "What conditions keep making this feel urgent?" That question tends to produce better answers. A craving may be coming from undereating earlier in the day. It may be coming from the habit of finishing every meal with sweetness. It may be coming from stress, poor sleep, a kitchen full of cues, or a routine built around sugary drinks. Once you ask about conditions rather than character, the whole problem becomes more workable. Food cravings are often conditioned responses to internal and external cues, and conditioned responses can be weakened and relearned over time. One of the most helpful first moves is also one of the least glamorous. Eat enough actual food before the craving hour arrives. Not a symbolic breakfast, not a lunch built out of optimism and coffee, not an afternoon held together by willpower and a protein bar you barely tasted. Regular meals matter because they prevent the reward system from being asked to solve emergencies that proper nourishment should have handled earlier. When people are underfed or poorly fed, sweet foods gain a built-in advantage. They're quick, obvious, and easy to imagine. A steadier foundation often takes some of the drama out of the afternoon and evening. WHO's current guidance emphasizes carbohydrate quality, recommending that carbohydrates come primarily from whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and pulses, with adults aiming for at least 25 grams of naturally occurring dietary fiber per day and at least 400 grams of fruits and vegetables. That kind of eating pattern is not morally superior. It is simply more likely to produce fuller, calmer signals than a day stitched together from refined, low-fiber foods. This is why peace with sugar usually begins with addition before subtraction. Add breakfast that actually lasts. Add lunch with protein, fiber, and enough volume to feel like a meal. Add fruit that is visible and easy to reach. Add beans, oats, yogurt, eggs, nuts, or whatever genuinely works in your ordinary life, rather than in a fantasy version of yourself who meal preps with orchestral music playing in the background. People often try to cut sweets while leaving the rest of the day structurally weak, and then they are surprised when the evening body starts bargaining. But a craving is much easier to handle from a nourished body than from a body trying to solve 3 deficits at once. The goal is not to become perfectly virtuous. It is to remove the sense that sugar is doing urgent repair work for a day that should have been better supported. WHO's diet guidance and NIDDK's public guidance both lean in that direction. Build healthier routines from workable, repeated steps rather than dramatic overcorrection. A second part of peace is learning the difference between planned sweetness and accidental sweetness. Those two experiences are not the same at all. Planned sweetness is the dessert you decide to have, the chocolate you sit down and enjoy, the cake at a celebration, the sweet food that belongs somewhere recognizable in your life. Accidental sweetness is the biscuit you barely remember eating while standing up, the handfuls from the cupboard during a stressed phone call, the sweetened drinks scattered through the day, the after-dinner grazing that keeps going because nothing feels complete. People often blame sugar in general for what is really a problem of unplanned repetition. If sweetness becomes deliberate rather than constant, it often loses some of its strange authority. This fits neatly with the broader evidence that cravings are reinforced by cues and repetition. Change the pattern enough times and the urgency can soften. That is why extreme prohibition is often less elegant than it sounds. For some people, strict avoidance of a personally triggering food is genuinely useful, and that should not be dismissed. But for many others, the all-or-nothing approach quietly turns sugar into a forbidden object, which keeps it psychologically bright and unusually powerful. The review literature on food cravings suggests that short-term selective deprivation can increase cravings for the avoided foods, even though the longer story is more complex than diet culture usually admits. In daily life, this often means that declaring war on one specific sweet food can make it occupy more mental space than it deserves. Peace works better when it lowers the emotional temperature. You do not need to worship sugar, and you do not need to dramatize it. You need a relationship in which it is allowed, not omnipresent, and not treated as evidence of moral collapse when it appears. A very practical place to intervene is drinks. Sugary drinks are an unusually efficient way for sweetness to become a constant companion, because they are easy to consume, easy to repeat, and often do not feel as substantial as their sugar content would suggest. CDC guidance continues to recommend cutting back on sugary drinks, choosing water or unsweetened options more often, and simply not stocking up on sugary beverages at home. That last point is more important than it sounds. The home environment matters. Peace with sugar is easier when the default options are less noisy. If every fridge shelf is an argument, the tired brain eventually gets drawn into debate. If cold water, sparkling water, unsweetened tea, or plain coffee are closer to hand, you have lowered the friction on the calmer choice without requiring heroic self-control every time you're thirsty or tired. Environment is not a minor detail here. It is one of the main characters. People often say they want better discipline when what they actually need is fewer negotiations. Do not keep your most cue-driven sweets in clear jars at eye level, if you already know you eat them automatically. Do not buy family-sized packs of things you reliably lose track of while telling yourself this time will be different, because you're in a stronger season of life. Put fruit where you can see it. Put less helpful foods where they require a decision rather than an impulse. NIDDK's habit change guidance openly encourages planning for setbacks, adjusting routines, and making small changes that can be kept. That is not trivial advice. It is the practical version of respecting how cue-responsive humans actually are. Another part of making peace is learning to protect the evening before the evening begins. If nights are where the trouble lives, then the answer usually starts at breakfast, lunch, and mid-afternoon, not at 9:17 p.m, when the biscuits have already started making their case. Enough food earlier in the day, fewer long gaps, more structured meals, and less accidental undereating tend to reduce how persuasive late-night sweetness feels. So do sleep and stress. NIDDK's public guidance explicitly includes healthier eating, enough sleep, managing stress, and small daily steps as part of the same long-term picture, which is exactly right. The sugar problem is often not a sugar problem alone. It is a tired body problem, an overcommitted day problem, a no real lunch problem, a no other reward problem. When those conditions improve even slightly, cravings often stop sounding quite so urgent. That last point about reward deserves more respect than it usually gets. Some people are trying to remove sugar from a life that is otherwise offering them very little softness, pleasure, spontaneity, or rest. Under those conditions, the evening treat starts carrying a symbolic weight far beyond its nutritional role. It becomes comfort, reward, transition, privacy, a small refusal to be managed by the day any longer. If that is true, then simply taking it away can make life feel meaner before it makes eating healthier. Peace with sugar may therefore require adding other forms of reward that are not edible. A walk after dinner, a proper pause in the afternoon, music, hot tea, a bath, reading, a call with someone calming, 10 minutes where nobody asks anything of you. This is not because a bath is nutritionally equivalent to chocolate. It is because the nervous system reaches for what reliably changes state, and it helps if food is not the only thing in the whole day offering relief. The same NIDDK material that treats healthy change as an ongoing routine rather than a one-time event is useful here too, because it makes room for realistic supports, rather than sheer restraint. There is also a quieter skill involved, and it has to do with noticing what kind of wanting is happening. Sometimes you're hungry in the plain old-fashioned sense and need food. Sometimes you're tired, restless, or stressed, and your mind has proposed sweetness as a solution. Sometimes the craving is cue-driven and arrives at the usual time regardless of what you have eaten. Sometimes it is a bit of all three. You do not have to become a philosopher every time this happens, but it does help to pause long enough to identify which situation you're in. If it is hunger, eat real food. If it is stress, ask whether sweetness is the only available regulator. If it is routine, consider changing the sequence rather than just resisting the urge inside the old sequence. The Psychology Review on Cravings distinguishes hunger from food, craving partly by specificity. Hunger can be eased by many foods, whereas craving is often specific and cue-linked. That distinction can be surprisingly useful in a kitchen. When people do decide to have something sweet, one of the most stabilizing things they can do is actually have it properly. Sit down. Put it on a plate if that helps. Taste it. Finish it. Then move on. That sounds obvious, but it's striking how often sweets are eaten in ways that maximize repetition and minimize satisfaction. Standing at the counter, half distracted, picking at leftovers, eating from a packet while scrolling, grazing from a cupboard without ever really deciding yes. That style of eating trains the brain beautifully and satisfies it rather badly. Peace is easier when the yes is a real yes, not a vague leak in attention. The point is not mindful eating as a performance. It is simply that a deliberate sweet is often less sticky than a dozen accidental ones. At the same time, it helps not to make desserts carry too much symbolic weight. A dessert can be pleasant, social, celebratory, or just part of a normal meal. Trouble often begins when every sweet thing becomes charged with compensation. I had a hard day, so I deserve this. I was good all morning, so I earned this. I ruined lunch, so the day is already lost. Those little narratives make sugar emotionally expensive. They turn it into a referendum on how well the day went, how disciplined you were, or what sort of person you are. The public health guidance is much drier and more helpful. Limit added or free sugars overall rather than turning them into moral objects. WHO continues to recommend limiting free sugars to less than 10% of total energy intake, with additional benefits possible below 5%, and CDC echoes the less than 10% message for added sugars in the US guidance. That framing is imperfect but useful, because it keeps the conversation on pattern rather than drama. A calmer relationship with sugar usually improves when the palate is given a chance to come down from constant intensity. This does not require a severe cleanse or a week of culinary sadness. It simply means creating more stretches of the day in which everything is not sweetened. Coffee without syrup, yogurt that does not taste like pudding, breakfast that is not dessert in a bowl, drinks that are mostly water, tea or coffee, rather than liquid sweetness in recurring disguise. WHO's recent carbohydrate quality guidance points in exactly this direction by emphasizing whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and pulses as preferred carbohydrate sources. The reward system does adapt. What tastes normal now is not fixed forever. A fruit can start feeling sweeter again. A plain meal can feel more complete. It just takes repetition, because the palate learns from what it meets most often. This is also why tiny sustainable changes beat grand purity every single time. Swap one sweet drink a day for water or an unsweetened option. Build one breakfast that reliably gets you through the morning. Stop keeping your most impulsive snack in the house for a while. Add one proper afternoon snack if that is when the collapse begins. Go to bed half an hour earlier if your evenings keep becoming food emergencies. Use a food diary briefly if it helps reveal patterns, not as a device for punishing yourself. NIDDK specifically recommends small steps, planning for setbacks, and using tracking tools if they help you discover useful changes. None of that is dramatic, which is precisely why it works better. Real lives are changed more by boring consistency than by noble declarations, and setbacks really do need to be treated as normal, not as evidence that the whole effort was fraudulent. That sounds soft, but it is actually one of the most practical rules in behaviour change. The person who eats too much sugar one evening and then returns to a steady breakfast the next morning does far better in the long run than the person who reacts by tightening everything, skipping meals, and rebuilding the exact conditions that make the next craving inevitable. NIDDK says almost this directly. Setbacks happen to everyone. Regroup and focus on your goals again, and remember that healthy eating is a lifelong behaviour rather than a one-time event. That is the tone worth borrowing. No melodrama, no punishment, no theatrical starting over. Just a return to structure. There will also be people for whom the issue is heavier than ordinary habit. If sugar cravings are tied to binge eating, significant distress, diabetes management, or a pattern that feels impossible to interrupt without spiralling, then it makes sense to bring in professional help. That is not a defeat. It is an accurate reading of scale. Public guidance is useful for ordinary patterns, but sometimes the appetite system is entangled with medical, psychological, or metabolic issues that deserve more tailored support. Peace with sugar includes the possibility that you do not have to solve every food problem alone in a kitchen at night while feeling ashamed. Most of all, peace means refusing the old fantasy that the goal is to become someone who no longer cares about sweetness at all. That is not necessary, and for many people it is not realistic. You are allowed to like sweet things. Humans generally do. The aim is simpler and more humane than that. You want a life in which sweetness is not running the schedule, not solving every stress response, not appearing automatically in every gap, and not making you feel as though your body is an enemy camp that must be subdued. When meals are steadier, drinks are calmer, cues are fewer, sleep is better, stress is less relentless, and sweet foods are chosen rather than drifted into, the whole relationship often becomes quieter. Sugar stops sounding like an emergency and starts sounding like what it probably should have been all along, one source of pleasure among many, sometimes worth having, never worth building a civil war around. WHO's guidance on sugars and carbohydrate quality, CDC's advice on drinks and added sugars, and NIDDK's emphasis on small, sustainable behaviour change all point toward that same broader picture, even if they say it in more institutional prose. And once you start living that way for a while, something subtle tends to happen. The cravings do not necessarily vanish in a dramatic puff of enlightenment. They just become less convincing. The afternoon feels more manageable. The kitchen is less theatrical. Dessert becomes a choice again. A biscuit is a biscuit, not a referendum. The body becomes easier to hear because fewer alarms are going off at once, which is a quiet enough place to leave it for now, with the feeling that the sweet tooth was never really the enemy in the first place, only a very old instinct that needed better conditions than the modern world usually gives it.